The story of the Vanderlinde Gang is one of the last great American legends, stretched across the dying light of the 1870s frontier and into the hard glare of the new century. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of men chasing freedom while the world quietly builds railroads, telegraphs, and prison walls around them. From its humble beginnings around campfires and backroom card tables to its bloody end beneath Pinkerton rifles and government law, this gang stands as the living embodiment of an America at war with itself. From the very beginning, the world was changing. The old ways were dying, even as Dutch van der Linde preached that they could be saved through courage, through family, through a philosophy of righteous outlaw rebellion. His speeches promised that civilization was the real criminal, that a small band of idealistic thieves could steal back what had been taken. Around him gathered lost souls and true believers, misfits and runaways, all clinging to the idea that this was more than crime. It was, in the truest sense, a dream of a different future. At the center of that dream stands Arthur Morgan. History remembers him as the outlaw who dies on a mountain, broken by disease and betrayal. But that is only the final frame of a much larger picture. Arthur is a man who keeps almost living, brushing his fingers against survival, redemption, and escape again and again. Every campfire move, every robbery, every whispered doubt in Dutch's tent is another moment where his story could have bent toward life instead of death. The Vanderlinde Gang becomes a mirror held up to America itself. Freedom versus civilization, loyalty versus betrayal, idealism versus brutal reality. Dutch's philosophy sounds noble until it collides with starving families and empty pockets. Hosea's wisdom cannot quite outrun the noose tightening around them, and Arthur's near escapes echo a country trying and failing to outrun its own sins. How many chances does a nation get to change course? How many does one man? This is the lens through which this entire saga unfolds. From the first rescues in the blizzard after Blackwater to the last ride toward Beaver Hollow, every fork in the road will be traced through Arthur's almost survivals. Strawberry, where a jailbreak could have been a goodbye. Rhodes, where a feud tears the illusion of family apart. St. Denis, where a single bank door opens onto the end of an era. Even a simple debt, collected from Thomas Downs, plants the invisible seed that will kill him. Along the way, Rockstar scatters a hidden trail of almost endings. Moments where siding with John, defying Micah, or walking away from Dutch hints at a life Arthur never reaches. His visits to the doctor, his warnings to John, his final choices on that mountain all suggest futures that die with him. This is not just how Arthur Morgan falls. This is every time he almost survived. This is the promise. Not just the tale of one doomed outlaw, but the complete story of the Vanderlinde Gang and Arthur Morgan's life, traced from the very beginning of Dutch and Hosea's partnership to the last bullets on that cold mountain and the quiet echoes that follow. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family built on freedom and broken by civilization. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s, the gang rises with the frontier itself. Dutch and Hosea meet as rival conmen, two men trying to rob each other and ending up laughing instead of shooting. In that moment, an idealistic philosophy is born: steal from the rich, protect the weak, stay ahead of the law, and never bow to a world that seems determined to crush the poor. Their campfires become classrooms, their robberies become arguments about justice, and their little circle of misfits becomes, in the truest sense, a family. Through that family, the narrative lens of this saga sharpens. Rather than simply retelling the missions of Red Dead Redemption 2 in order, this journey follows every major point where Arthur might have survived longer, lived differently, or saved more than he loses. Each fork in the road becomes a question. Could this have gone another way? Each debt collected, each jailbreak, each whispered warning to John becomes an almost ending that hangs over what follows. The time span stretches across a changing continent, from snowbound heists in the 1870s and 1880s to the fading outlaw years of 1899 and beyond. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the gang is dragged, step by bloody step, into the new century. Railroads carve lines through wilderness, Pinkertons replace dusty sheriffs, and industry turns open plains into fenced-off property. Against that relentless march of civilization, Dutch's speeches grow louder, Hosea's doubts grow deeper, and Arthur's chances to walk away grow rarer. Along this path, the viewer is promised more than a chain of shootouts. This is a story of backstories and buried lore, Hosea's brief attempt at a quiet life with Bessie and the Grizzlies, the feud with Colm O'Driscoll that twists Dutch from thinker to fanatic, the tuberculosis that slips into Arthur's lungs during a debt collection he almost refuses. Hidden in those moments are the in-game choices that bend tone and legacy, sparing or killing, helping or abandoning, siding with John or clinging to Dutch. Familiar missions will be reframed as crossroads. Strawberry will not just be a jailbreak, it will be one of Arthur's last clean exits. Rhodes will not just be a southern tragedy, it will be the point where the gang's dream of freedom curdles. Saint Denis will not just be a bank job, it will be the day the philosophy collapses under modern rifles and electric light. To understand every time Arthur almost survived, the story must return to where that survival first became possible, the unlikely moment when two wandering outlaws met a lost soul and decided to build a gang around him. The story does not begin with Arthur on a cliff or a battlefield. It begins with two strangers in a muddy little town, each convinced he is the smartest outlaw in the room. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang is born out of a joke that almost turns into a gunfight. Dutch Vanderlinde arrives first, all coat flares and sermonizing charm, working a traveling banker con on a wealthy merchant who thinks civilization has finally reached him. Dutch speaks of freedom and opportunity, of a world rigged against honest men, turning his victim's greed into a weapon. Across the street, Hosea Matthews watches, amused, because he is running the exact same mark on the exact same man. The moment is almost theatrical. Dutch is charismatic, theatrical, and idealistic, already delivering speeches as if the whole world is his audience. Hosea is wry, practical, observant, a man who measures rooms, exits, and egos in a single glance. When their shared target realizes he has been promised the same guaranteed return twice, panic sparks, hands go to holsters, and the old ways were dying in that instant without anyone realizing it. Guns half drawn, eyes narrowed, each man thinks he has caught an amateur poaching his score. Then recognition hits. The patter is too smooth, the timing too perfect, the courage too real. Two smart outlaws, seeing through each other's tricks at the very beginning. The absurdity of it all breaks the tension, the merchant flees, and what should have been a shootout collapses into laughter in the dust. That laughter is the seed of everything that follows. Dutch recognizes in Hosea a partner who can ground his philosophy, someone who can turn grand speeches into workable plans. Hosea sees in Dutch the living embodiment of a dream he half believed was gone, an idealistic outlaw who wants more than quick scores, who talks about family, loyalty, and a life outside a corrupt system. Is it a genuine vision, or the first glimmer of delusions that will one day consume him? They spend that night talking under lamplight in a cheap room, trading stories of failed cons and close escapes. Conflict becomes camaraderie, rivalry becomes partnership. Together, they realize they can run bigger, smarter jobs, choose their targets, and perhaps live, in the truest sense, by their own rules. The world was changing, but they would not simply bow to it. In that decision lies a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a future boy named Arthur Morgan who will find in these men something he never truly had, a family. The standard they set that night, of mutual respect and shared ideals, will become the measure Arthur uses when the gang begins to rot from the inside. When Dutch stops laughing, when Hosea's caution is gone, what will be left of that first, improbable joke? The answer begins with the next lost soul they bring into their circle. The next lost soul did not arrive with fanfare or prophecy. He arrived with a sermon. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang was never just a cluster of thieves around a campfire. Dutch insisted it was a philosophy, a story of freedom wrestled back from a world that had already sold it to banks and railroads. Around those early fires, his speeches rolled on for hours. The government was rotten, the rich were parasites, civilization was a cage built for the poor and the different. In Dutch's mind, the answer was simple and grand. Live free, beyond the reach of titles and ledgers, as a family of outcasts bound by loyalty rather than law. Rob the institutions that profited from misery. Strike at the railroads carving the land, the banks hoarding coin, the agents who came with clipboards and guns. In the truest sense, he wanted the gang to be the living embodiment of resistance. Honest men doing dishonest work in a dishonest world. Hosea believed in that dream, but he believed in survival more. Where Dutch saw manifest destiny to rob the rich, Hosea saw margins, escape routes, and consequences. He preferred a con to a gunfight, a swindle to a shootout, a forged deed over a burning train. Dutch would talk about shaking the foundations of civilization. Hosea would quietly ask how many Pinkertons that foundation could throw back at them. Together, they built something strange, something that sat between fantasy and necessity. The gang became a hybrid, part found family for the broken and unwanted, part utopian experiment in living outside the hypocrisy of the law. Orphans, runaways, ex-soldiers, former slaves, people who had nowhere else to go found a place where names did not matter as much as loyalty. Around them, the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch promised they could outrun that tide. There was a code, flexible yet fiercely preached. Do not rob the poor. Do not hurt those who have nothing. Take from the rich, the powerful, the men with vaults and titles, and use that money to keep the camp fed and the children safe. Violence, Dutch insisted, was a last resort, a tragic necessity forced on them by a cruel civilization. But even in these early days, the mask slipped. A banker's insult, a lawman's sneer, a rival's taunt, and Dutch's temper could turn a clean getaway into a bloodbath. That was the core contradiction taking root from the very beginning. The same ideals that drew Arthur to him, the promise of freedom, family, and purpose, could, in a single breath, be twisted into justification. Robbery became justice. Revenge became principle. Betrayal could, one day, be dressed up as strategy. What happens when a philosophy that once saved a boy's life becomes the excuse for throwing lives away? The answer will emerge as that family grows, and as Dutch's dream meets a world that refuses to bend. Before Dutch's dream can poison a campfire, it has to save someone first. Before it becomes an excuse for betrayal, it arrives as a lifeline thrown to a drowning boy. Arthur Morgan's story begins in the shadows of a man who never learned anything but crime. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty outlaw drifting along the edges of civilization, stealing enough to stay drunk and ahead of the law, but never enough to build a future. Arrested, locked away, and dead before long, Lyle left his son with no inheritance except a reputation and a trajectory, a short, brutal life as another nameless thief the world would barely remember. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's path was narrow. He was big for his age, quick with his fists, and already running errands for rough men on rougher streets. No mother to steady him, no teacher to guide him, only a growing talent for trouble. In another version of this story, that is where it ends. A teenager hanged outside some county jail, or shot in an alley over a few dollars in a bad card game. Instead, the very beginning of the Vanderlinde legend collides with this half-formed outlaw. Dutch and Hosea come across Arthur as a teenager, already in chains, already marked for the noose. Alone, angry, caught by the law, and headed toward an ending everyone expects for boys like him. They could have walked past, shrugged, and let the world claim one more lost soul. They do not. Dutch talks, as he always does. Hosea watches, as he always does. Between them, they make a decision that will echo through decades. They take Arthur in, cut him loose from the law's wagon, and give him a horse instead of a rope. It is, in the truest sense, a rescue. What follows is a dual apprenticeship that shapes the gang's future. Dutch feeds Arthur's mind with stories and philosophy, with talk of freedom and loyalty, of a world rigged against men who refuse to kneel. He teaches Arthur to read, to argue, to believe that their crimes are a protest against a corrupt civilization where the world was changing and the old ways were dying. Hosea, by contrast, teaches him how not to die, how to shoot straight and keep his nerve, how to track game in the snow and people in the dark, how to con a mark without pulling a gun, and how to vanish when the Pinkertons come calling. Arthur becomes more than a proc. He becomes a surrogate son, the living embodiment of Dutch's claim that broken people can be remade through this chosen family. Every time Arthur rides at his side, every time he repeats Dutch's words around the camp, it tells Dutch his philosophy works. It creates a powerful loop. Arthur needs Dutch to have been saved. Dutch needs Arthur to prove he can save. Yet hidden inside that salvation is Arthur's first almost survival. Without Dutch and Hosea, he likely dies young and forgotten. With them, he lives, grows, and finds a family he will one day need to escape but cannot abandon. How does a man walk away from the very hands that pulled him off the gallows? As the gang grows, that question will define Arthur's fate. turning early mercy into a chain as strong as iron. That mercy hardens into devotion. The boy hauled off the gallows becomes the man who would rather die than see Dutch in chains. And over the next decade, Arthur Morgan turns from frightened teenager into the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. From its humble beginnings as a ragged camp of drifters, the Vanderlinde Gang becomes Arthur's whole world. At first, he is quiet, half feral, watching Dutch and Hosea argue about plans and principles by the fire. Dutch talks about freedom, about civilization crushing the poor, about a rigged system that needs to be robbed just to feel honest. Hosea reminds him that grand speeches do not fill bellies. Arthur listens to both, but it is Dutch's voice that sinks deepest. The very beginning of his adult life is spent treating those fireside monologues as scripture. Arthur grows fast. Raids on stagecoaches, rustling cattle, small-town banks that never see them coming. Each job is another lesson. Dutch teaches him to stand tall, to never apologize for who he is. Hosea shows him when to walk away. The scared boy who once stole from pockets and alleyways becomes the gang's blunt instrument, the one who rides in first and leaves last. He is the one who drags drunk Bill out of trouble, who stares down bounty hunters, who makes sure the camp stays safe while Dutch dreams. That natural toughness, combined with a loyalty bordering on faith, makes Arthur the perfect enforcer. When discipline is needed, it is Arthur who knocks sense into a wayward member, who collects debts from men like Thomas Downs, who does the dirty work so Dutch's hands can stay clean in theory if not in truth. To outsiders, he is a thug with a gun. To the gang, he is the quiet backbone that holds Dutch's grand designs upright. In Arthur's mind, this is not mere banditry. It is a story of resistance and survival, of family against the world. Dutch insists they are not predators, but avengers, robbing railroads, banks, and oil men who profit off misery. Arthur believes him. He tells himself they are different from the O'Driscolls, different from the gangs that kill for sport. They have rules. They protect women and children. They look after their own. Is it crime if civilization drew first blood? That belief gives Arthur something he has never had: identity, purpose, a place where his violence feels righteous. He is not a lost soul drifting from saloon to saloon. He is Dutch's right hand, part of a family with a mission. That sense of belonging makes sacrifice easy. Long nights in the saddle, bullets, scars, years spent on the run, all of it becomes proof that the cause is real. But the stronger that faith grows, the more dangerous it becomes. Every success reinforces Dutch's words. Every close call that ends with laughter around the campfire convinces Arthur they are blessed, chosen, destined to stay one step ahead while the old ways were dying. When the cracks finally appear, when plans fail, when Dutch's mercy shrivels, how can a man who built his whole life on those dreams admit they were delusions? Each time the gang moves camp, each time Dutch demands one more risk, Arthur passes another invisible exit. He could leave with Hosea when doubt flickers. He could push John to run sooner. He could refuse the orders that stain his soul. Instead, he doubles down, riding harder, enforcing harsher, trusting deeper. That is the tragedy being forged beneath the triumph. Every act of loyalty that keeps him alive in the short term tightens the noose that will one day close around his throat. But Dutch is not content with one prodigal son. The pattern that saves Arthur will not remain unique. The philosophy that once felt intimate and improvised begins to repeat itself, and the next time it takes shape. It wears the face of John Marston. John's story begins in a darker place than Arthur's, an orphanage, not a home. Abuse instead of neglect. From the very beginning, his world is defined by institutions that claim to protect children while grinding them down. He runs before those walls can finish the job, a boy slipping into a world of alleys, rail yards, and cold nights, stealing bread and scraps, nearly starving long before the law ever learns his name. If Arthur was saved from becoming a petty outlaw, John is rescued from becoming another unmarked grave. Dutch finds him in that state, half wild and half dead, and recognizes something familiar. Another stray, another lost soul, another chance to prove that his grand philosophy is more than talk. From its humble beginnings, the gang has always been presented as a family in the truest sense, a sanctuary from civilization's cruelty, and John becomes the next test of that idealistic dream. Dutch offers him food, warmth, a coat, a gun, and the same promise he gave Arthur: freedom, purpose, and a place where the old ways were dying only because men like them refused to bow. Yet the echo is not perfect. Where Arthur stepped into Dutch's orbit almost gratefully, hungry for a father and eager to believe, John keeps a sliver of distance. He listens, he learns, he rides, but he does not worship. Arthur is the living embodiment of Dutch's rhetoric at this stage, quoting his lines, defending his decisions, enforcing his will. John, younger and more independent, tests the edges, questions quietly, disappears for stretches when the life chafes too hard. One son leans in, the other leans away. How long can that imbalance last? This difference hardens into a subtle rivalry. Around the campfire, in the planning of jobs, in the quick glances after praise or criticism, a quiet competition takes root. Arthur shoulders responsibility, collects debts, keeps order, wears loyalty like armor. John bristles at being handled, drifts toward Abigail and the idea of a smaller family within the larger one, already dreaming of something beyond the outlaw caravan. Dutch, who thrives on being needed, feeds both sides without fully meaning to, praising Arthur's reliability one moment and John's potential the next. That tension will not stay small. It will grow through botched jobs, disappearances, and arguments about duty and escape, until, on a blood-red mountain years later, the believer must decide whether the doubter is the only part of Dutch's dream worth saving. And when that moment comes, whose survival will Arthur finally choose, Dutch's dying philosophy, or John's fragile chance at a different world? That tension has roots not in gunfire, but in the quiet rhythms of camp, in the early jobs where Arthur and John stand shoulder to shoulder. In the very beginning of 1899, in the snowbound misery of Coulter, they ride out together to rescue a lost soul named John Marston, torn apart by wolves and pride. Arthur curses him, drags him back, and in the same breath proves the paradox that will define them: contempt on the surface, loyalty underneath. From its humble beginnings, their partnership is a story of brothers in arms who never quite stop measuring each other. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook, Arthur hauls water, hunts game, keeps the ledgers, while John lingers at the edge of camp life, half present, half absent, always with one eye on Abigail and Jack. On jobs, Arthur is the steady hand, the man Dutch trusts to ride point. John is the one who disappears for months, then returns with a scar and an excuse. One lives the gang's routine. The other resists being fully domesticated by its rules. Dutch understands this difference, and he exploits it. To Arthur, he praises discipline, calling him his best man, the living embodiment of the gang's supposed philosophy. To John, he sells freedom, indulging the rebellious streak, framing every reckless ride as proof that the boy he raised still believes. Praise becomes a weapon. Approval becomes currency. Both men orbit Dutch's shifting sun, each convinced that his loyalty will be the one that finally earns a place in the future Dutch keeps promising. Yet beneath the friction, their bond is real. Both were taken in as teenagers after lives already heading toward the noose. Both were taught to read Dutch's books and Hosea's cons, to see civilization as a rigged game and outlaw life as the only honest answer. Around the camp, when the talk quiets and the whiskey runs low, Arthur and John share the same haunted question. Without Dutch, what would they have been? Farmhands? Drifters? Corpses in an unmarked ditch? Then comes the pattern interrupt. John has a family. Abigail and Jack turn every argument about loyalty into an argument about survival. When the Rhodes feud steals Jack, Arthur watches John unravel, and something shifts. The gang is no longer just a band of dreamers, it is a threat to a child. The old ways were dying, and that child's future is the proof. As the world was changing and Dutch's plans grow wilder, from Saint Denis to Guarma and back, Arthur's doubts harden while John's desire to protect Abigail and Jack intensifies. Their paths bend toward collision. Each robbery, each failed escape, becomes another moment Arthur could walk away with John, or John could stay and drown with Dutch. Soon, that choice will no longer be theoretical. It will come down to a mountain, a ride, and one final decision about which man and which dream deserves to live. Before that mountain, before that final choice between Dutch's dream and John's survival, the gang had been something else entirely. From its humble beginnings, it was sold as a haven, a family a story of broken people finding freedom together on the edge of a world that wanted them dead or tamed. As Dutch's reputation grew, so did the campfires. Bill Williamson came first among the notable early recruits, a former soldier turned insecure gunman. The army had trained him to kill, then discarded him when the killing no longer had a uniform. Dutch found him drunk and furious, a man whose temper ran hotter than his courage. In Bill, Dutch claimed to see potential. In truth, he also saw a blunt instrument, someone who needed orders to feel worth anything at all. Javier Escuela arrived with a guitar on his back and revolution on his tongue. A fugitive from political violence in Mexico, he framed every robbery as resistance, every shot fired as another blow against corrupt civilization. Around the fire, Javier's stories made Dutch's philosophy sound heroic rather than desperate, turning train jobs into epics and stagecoach ambushes into chapters in a larger war. For a young outlaw searching for meaning, could there be anything more intoxicating? Others followed, drifters with no land to their name, ex-soldiers who knew only how to march and shoot, women who had discovered that in the eyes of the law they possessed almost no power at all. To each, Dutch offered the same promise. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. But under his banner they could still live free. In the truest sense, he cast the gang as the living embodiment of resistance to a rigged order. Daily life reflected that illusion. Camps tucked into timberlines and river bends, coffee boiling at dawn, stew bubbling at dusk, children chasing dogs between wagons, Hosea telling stories of long cons and close calls, Javier strumming melancholic songs while the embers fell. Robberies were planned between jokes and arguments, executed with a sense of adventure rather than starvation. They stole, yes, but they laughed, loved, and mourned together. To Arthur, whose blood family had failed him early, this was not a crew. It was the only home that had ever held. That belonging carried a cost. Each new member arrived with a tale of betrayal by civilization, reinforcing Dutch's belief that only his way offered salvation. Yet as the circle around the fire widened, so did the gap between his words and his choices. He spoke of protecting his people, of loyalty above all. Then he sent those same people against armored cars, into towns crawling with law, into feuds with men as ruthless as himself. How many times did a promised simple job turn into a bloodbath? Even in these early, almost idyllic years, the seeds were there. The bigger the family grew, the bigger the scores Dutch chased to feed it, and the more lives he was willing to gamble. A refuge was quietly becoming a roulette table, and every new lost soul who joined the gang only raised the stakes for the tragedy to come. The pattern that followed would define the rest of their lives. Pull a job, vanish into the horizon, set up camp, pretend the world beyond the firelight did not exist. Then the law, the Pinkertons, or some angry victim would get too close, and the whole traveling family would uproot again, dragging wagons, horses, memories, and ghosts to the next hiding place. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang treated the frontier itself as a shifting home. One season they were tucked into the snow-choked cliffs of the Grizzlies. Another, they were overlooking the rail lines and river traffic from Horseshoe Overlook. Later still, they were sunk into the swamps of Lemoyne. Each camp felt temporary, but safe, a pocket of freedom carved out from a hostile civilization. Each one was also a countdown. In those early years, the heists mostly worked. A train job here, a stagecoach there, a carefully rehearsed con that left some rich industrialist a little poorer and Dutch a little more convinced that his philosophy was the living embodiment of resistance. Hosea would pose as a harmless old man, draw in a mark with gentle words, and then reveal the sharp edge beneath. Arthur and John would ride down on armored cars, moving with the precision of men who had survived 100 gunfights already. When a robbery went clean, Dutch saw proof that his dreams were not delusions. A successful train heist against a wealthy magnate meant, to him, that the gang could always stay one step ahead, that intelligence and daring could forever outpace the slow march of progress. Was it any wonder he believed one more score could solve everything? But beyond the campfires and card games, the world was changing. Iron tracks cut through valleys where buffalo once roamed. Telegraph wires stitched distant towns into a single nervous system, carrying news of robberies faster than any horse could run. Steamships, factories, and modern rifles all whispered the same quiet verdict: the old ways were dying. The gang saw these signs every time they robbed a train bristling with armed guards, every time Pinkertons arrived with precise information no local sheriff could have gathered alone. Yet around the stew pot, Dutch still spoke of Tahiti, of orchards and sugar fields, of a paradise untouched by civilization. In the truest sense, Tahiti was never a place. It was an excuse not to look at the telegraph poles marching past the horizon. So the pattern continued. Bolter to Horseshoe, Horseshoe to Clemens Point to Shady Bell to Beaver Hollow. Each move promised a fresh start, a wider circle of freedom. But in reality, the circle was shrinking. Every new camp sat closer to the edge of the map and closer to the reach of the modern state that hunted them. What began as a roaming refuge was turning into a tightening noose. Every time the gang escaped, the world closed in a little more, setting the stage for the moments when escape would no longer be possible, and Arthur's almost survivals would start to run out. The noose finally tightens in Blackwater, not in the snow, not in St. Denis, but on a quiet stretch of river where one last ferry job is supposed to buy the gang its freedom. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang had chased a single dream, one score big enough to walk away. Dutch and Hosea called it retirement, a ranch somewhere far from civilization, a story of outlaws who slipped the net and grew old in peace. Blackwater, in the spring of 1899, is where that dream seems closest to real. Dutch hears of a boat carrying bonds, cash, and valuables, guarded but not a military convoy, and he turns it into a philosophy in the truest sense. One last robbery, one last act of defiance against a world that was changing. On paper, the plan is clean. Hit the ferry fast, grab the money, disappear before the Pinkertons can react. Arthur is there as Dutch's right hand, the living embodiment of the gang's loyalty and long service, alongside Javier, Bill, and others who have ridden with Dutch for years. This is not a reckless smash and grab. This is meant to be the exit. The moment when all the sacrifices pay off and the old ways were dying somewhere far away from them. Instead, everything breaks. The Pinkertons are waiting, tipped off, or simply quicker than Dutch ever imagined. Civilians scream, gunfire rips across polished decks, and the neat lines of Dutch's philosophy dissolve into smoke and blood. In the chaos, Dutch shoots a woman who is not holding a gun, not part of any posse, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a gang that has always pretended to rob the rich and spare the innocent, that single shot is a crack running straight through the myth. How can Dutch still claim the moral high ground when the river itself is carrying away the proof that he has lost control? Arthur survives the ferry, but survival comes with a cost. The take is abandoned, bodies are left behind, and the gang flees Blackwater with Pinkertons on their heels and a fortune sitting unclaimed beneath the law's new empire. That money is not just cash. It is the lost future where Arthur might have vanished into the vastness of the West, an anonymous rancher or retired outlaw, rich enough to stop running. If that score had worked, if Dutch had walked away when the plan first went wrong, how many graves would be empty? Instead, the next chapter opens in white silence. The gang rides north into the grizzlies, into blizzards and hunger, broke, hunted, and already haunted. As the horses push through the drifts after Blackwater, Arthur watches Dutch, and something in his gaze has changed. There is excitement where there should be remorse, defiance where there should be doubt. The first great escape has failed, and Arthur's almost survival has slipped through his fingers. The question is no longer whether the gang can get out. It is what Dutch will do to pretend they still can. The snowstorm in the Grizzlies does not feel like an escape. It feels like a punishment. The gang's flight from Blackwater ends not with triumph and fresh horses, but with half-frozen riders pushing through white silence, dragging wagons, bodies, and regret up into the teeth of the mountain. Freedom has never looked so narrow as it does on that trail. By the time they stumble into the abandoned mining town of Coulter, they are starving, soaked, and grieving. Davy is dying in the wagon. Jenny is already gone. The Grand Ferry robbery that was supposed to fund a new life has become a story of loss and confusion, of plans whispered and then swallowed by wind. The buildings around them are empty shells, the remnant of another failed dream, a reminder that from its humble beginnings, every frontier enterprise can end in silence and snow. In those first frozen days, Dutch talks. Arthur works. While Dutch gathers the shivering remnants of this outlaw family around a fire and spins a philosophy of temporary hardship and inevitable comeback, Arthur pulls on his coat and rides into the storm. He hunts deer with numb hands. He checks on the lookouts. He follows Javier into the white void to find John. Half dead and clawing his way through the drifts, the living embodiment of a man too stubborn to die. That rescue is not heroic in the romantic sense. It is ugly, slow, and desperate. Wolves circle. The wind drowns every word. Arthur drags John's ruined body back to Coulter step by step, not because Dutch ordered it, but because this is what loyalty means in the true sense. Not speeches, but frostbite and blood on the snow. Dutch will later claim the moment as proof of his leadership. The reality belongs to Arthur. Coulter strips away the glamour Dutch has been selling for years. There are no railroads to rob, no balls to attend in stolen suits, no grand gestures against civilization, only thin stew and thinner blankets. The gang ceases to feel like free spirits on the run and becomes a camp of refugees huddled in the dark, clinging to Dutch's assurances that this is temporary, that the world was changing, but he is still one step ahead. Yet every breath they take shows how the old ways were dying around them. Here, for the first time, Arthur's faith flickers. He listens to Dutch promise that Blackwater was a mistake, not a pattern. He hears talk of Tahiti, of one last score, of the same dreams repackaged as destiny. And in the quiet, he wonders, who really buried them in this mountain? The Pinkertons or Dutch's pride? Still, he doubles down on his role as protector. He checks on the women. He steadies the boys. He carries the weight Dutch refuses to admit exists. Coulter becomes the first near survival, the first moment where walking away might have saved him, yet staying feels inevitable, because Coulter is not just a setback. It is the template. Every escape Dutch leads from here will be colder, hungrier, more desperate, until the pattern that begins in this frozen graveyard finally consumes them all. From that frozen graveyard, the world tilts. The gang rides down out of Coulter, out of the white void and into color again, and for a moment it feels as if the story might be changing. Snow gives way to mud, dead trees to green fields, and the small railroad town of Valentine appears on the horizon like a promise. Horseshoe Overlook is modest, but after Coulter it feels almost luxurious. There is grass instead of ice, a river instead of frozen air, and work to be had in the nearby town. From its humble beginnings on that ridge, the new camp becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's favorite argument, that the gang is resilient, that freedom can still be taken from a world closing in. Tents go up, wagons are circled, and for the first time since Blackwater, laughter carries across the firelight. Valentine itself is chaos wrapped in wood and dust. It is drunk ranch hands and cheap rooms, muddy streets and half-built civilization, a place where the old ways were dying but not yet gone. Bar fights erupt over nothing and end in everyone buying each other drinks. Two men try to rob each other in an alley and end up comparing techniques. Poker games stretch long into the night, with Arthur at the table, grumbling and smirking, surrounded by the family that once saved him from being just another lost soul on the streets. The missions in this era reflect that temporary high. Helping a rancher with his cattle, escorting John as he awkwardly tries to be a father, riding into town with Javier or Charles for work that feels almost honest. It becomes, in the truest sense, a story of recovery, of routine, of days where gunfire is the exception rather than the rule. Is it any wonder Arthur begins to believe Dutch might pull them through again? Dutch seizes on this upswing with practiced ease. Around the campfire, he frames Blackwater as an unfortunate accident, a single misstep in an otherwise righteous philosophy. The dream, he insists, is still alive. One more job, one more score, and the gang can disappear to some imagined paradise where civilization never reaches them. Arthur's loyalty is rewarded with purpose, with plans, with the sense that all his suffering in the snow was leading somewhere. Yet even in this warmth, warning signs flicker. Dutch's talk of a big score grows more obsessive. Simple, steady work in and around Valentine is never enough. He wants trains, banks, bold gestures that will prove he was right from the very beginning. Hosea counsels caution, suggests quieter cons and smaller risks, but Dutch brushes him aside as tired, as old, as afraid. Who wants to fade when legend is within reach? In Valentine lies another almost survival. If Dutch had accepted those smaller jobs, if he had chosen a life of modest robberies and backroom deals instead of grand statements, the gang could have melted into the background, forgotten by history. Instead, this brief illusion of recovery becomes fuel for greater delusions, pushing them toward a future written not in obscurity, but in blood. because Valentine does not save them. It only teaches Dutch that survival without glory is a fate worse than death, and that belief will guide every choice that follows. Valentine proves the gang can still eat. Strauss proves how they now have to. In the shadow of Dutch's grand speeches about freedom and loyalty, his bookkeeper quietly expands a different arm of the operation, usury. Loans to the desperate, interest for the camp, and when the money does not come back, men like Arthur go out to collect. It is profit without glory, cruelty wrapped in ledgers and ink. From its humble beginnings, the gang told itself it robbed the rich and corrupt, that this was a story of rebellion against a rigged civilization. Strauss's work exposes the lie. His debtors are not railroad barons or politicians. They are farmers, widows, and laborers clinging to survival in a world that was changing faster than they can keep up. Dutch tolerates it, even defends it, because the camp needs supplies and the dream needs funding. The philosophy bends, then cracks under the weight of practical hunger. Into this moral gray steps Thomas Downs, a gaunt man, already coughing, already failing, working the fields outside Valentine with his wife and young son. He owes money to Strauss, and the deadline has passed. So Arthur rides out, the loyal enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's will. He does not want this job. He does it anyway. Because that is what family means to him in this moment, doing what must be done. Even when it tastes bitter, the encounter is almost mundane at the very beginning. No gunfight, no train robbery, just a sick man pleading that he has nothing. Arthur shoves him, threatens him, pushes him down into the mud. Downs struggles, panics, and then doubles over in a violent fit of coughing. Blood sprays across Arthur's face and coat. It seems incidental, an unpleasant detail in an unpleasant task. Then the moment passes, the money still unpaid, the debt merely postponed. In the truest sense, this is the hinge of Arthur Morgan's life. That spatter of blood is the likely transmission of tuberculosis, the slow, invisible bullet that has already left the barrel. The player cannot truly avoid it. The mission is woven into the fabric of the story, an unavoidable crossing of paths between a powerful outlaw and a dying man. A single routine job becomes the quiet death sentence that will haunt every choice that follows. Arthur rides away convincing himself it was necessary. Strauss needed collecting, the camp needed food, Dutch needed loyalty. He has not yet begun to question the philosophy that turned him from lost soul to trusted lieutenant, so he buries the discomfort under habit and duty. How could he know that his body has already been claimed by a disease that does not care about honor, family, or dreams of freedom? Yet the question lingers in the dust behind his horse. What if this line had been drawn differently? What if Dutch had refused Strauss's methods, or Arthur had finally said no? Without this debt, without this cough, would the gang's tragedy still carve the same path through the dying West? Or has destiny just been rewritten in blood he never meant to spill? The blood on Arthur's hands from Thomas Downs is still fresh in the story when the next chance at survival rides in dressed as a rescue. A sick man, a poisoned future, and then Dutch sends him to Strawberry, not to rest, not to heal, but to save the loudest gun in the gang. Micah Bell has done what Micah Bell always does. He has pushed too far. In Strawberry, a quiet town clinging to the old ways and wooden porches, he stirs up trouble, kills a man, and ends up in a cell. To Dutch, this is not a liability, but an opportunity. Micah is presented as valuable, as the living embodiment of Dutch's new philosophy, bold, ruthless, unafraid of civilization's laws. So Arthur is ordered to ride up into the pines and pull him out, as if this is just another chore for the family. From the very beginning of that ride, Arthur's reluctance hangs in the air. His journal, his muttered lines, his silences around Micah all circle the same unease. This man is dangerous in a way that goes beyond normal outlaw risk. Dutch sees a weapon. Arthur sees a fuse. Yet loyalty, habit, and years under Dutch's voice push him through Strawberry streets toward the jail. What follows is not a clean jailbreak, it is chaos. Arthur rigs the winch, tears open the wall, and the town erupts. Micah steps out of the cell, not grateful, not cautious, but hungry. He takes a gun and starts killing with an almost gleeful precision, dragging Arthur through a storm of bullets, bodies, and burning buildings. A simple extraction becomes a massacre, turning a sleepy mountain town into a battlefield the gang cannot afford. Here, the pattern interrupt is brutal and simple. Arthur could walk away. The sheriff offers no mercy to Micah, the noose is waiting, and the world was changing in ways Micah could never accept. One step back, one refusal, and Strawberry becomes a grave instead of a spark. Would the Pinkertons still come? Almost certainly. Would Dutch still chase dreams and delusions across the map? Of course. But without Micah whispering in his ear, without that constant needle of flattery and betrayal, the path might have bent, even slightly. This is one of Arthur's purest almost survivals. No tuberculosis here, no unavoidable debt. Just a choice buried under orders and old loyalties: save the lost soul in the cell, or let the rope do what the law intends. In the truest sense, he chooses Dutch, and by extension, he chooses Micah. Arthur rides out of Strawberry with the town behind him in ruins, and Micah alive at his side, not realizing that the man he just freed will help destroy the gang from its humble beginnings to its bitter end. The old ways were dying, but Arthur has just ensured that the thing replacing them is not freedom or family, but treachery on a horse with a silver tongue. Micah rides free, the town of Strawberry burns behind them, and the gang moves on as if one more reckless rescue is just part of the story. But the road south does not lead to safety. It leads to Rhodes. On the surface, Rhodes is peaceful. Whitewashed porches, lazy streets, a sleepy southern town that seems untouched by the chaos tearing the rest of the world apart. Beneath that calm, though, lies a vicious feud between two decaying dynasties. The Braithwaites and the Greys, families clinging to a world that should have died with the plantations. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch Vanderlinde looks at that quiet main street and sees opportunity. From the very beginning, Dutch sells Rhodes to the gang as a breather, a chance to rebuild after Blackwater and Coulter and Strawberry. In truth, he sees it as a chessboard. The Braithwaites on one side, the Greys on the other, and his family in the middle, moving between them for profit. Hosea, ever the strategist, slips into polite conversations and card games. Dutch delivers speeches about freedom and civilization even as he agrees to run errands for men who own chain gangs and burned fields. The gang embeds itself in the town's politics almost without noticing. Arthur rides guard for gray wagons, walks through Braithwaite halls, escorts deputies and drinks in saloons under borrowed names. They run moonshine, break up labor, and stir trouble that has been smoldering for generations. Two outlaw conmen who once tried to rob each other are now mediating the hatred of old plantation lords. There is a dry, cruel irony in that. For Dutch and Hosea, it is a story of leverage and illusion, of playing both sides until the money is on the table and the gang can vanish. For Arthur, it becomes something else. He starts to feel the weight of it, the sense that they are no longer robbing faceless express companies or nameless banks, but stepping into a centuries-old nightmare that has nothing to do with their ideals. What does Dutch's philosophy mean when he is taking coin from the same men who built the cages he claims to fight? Hosea feels it too. His instincts pull toward caution, toward pulling out before pride turns to betrayal. He murmurs doubts at the campfire, warns Dutch that these people are poison, that this town is the living embodiment of a dying order that will drag them down with it. Dutch hears him, but does not listen. The price arrives under a blood-red sky. The Braithwaite ambush, the ride into Rhodes, Sean laughing on the wagon 1 second and gone the next, his skull opened by a sniper's bullet. It is sudden, shocking, merciless, one of the gang's brightest sparks extinguished in the middle of the street, in front of lawmen, citizens, and the very families that use them. Dutch's clever scheme turns to raw, public grief. In that moment, the cost of Dutch's game ceases to be theoretical. The family he claims to protect is bleeding on the cobblestones, and Arthur is left staring at a boy's body and wondering how many more graves this philosophy will dig. Could this have been different? If Dutch had heeded Hosea and walked away, if Arthur had pushed harder, refused jobs, forced a confrontation before Rhodes exploded, would Sean still be alive? Would Jack stay safe? Would trust remain unbroken? Rhodes becomes another almost survival, another crossroads where the gang could have stepped off the path. They could have taken what they had, moved on before the feud swallowed them. Instead, they stay, and the cracks widen. Sean's death does not end the game. It escalates it, driving Dutch further into pride, Hosea deeper into worry, and Arthur closer to the realization that this family is heading toward a place no one can ride away from. And Rhodes is not finished with them yet. Rhodes takes its final payment in the dark. Sean is barely in the ground when the Braithwaites strike back, turning Dutch's game of pride into a story of open war. The feud that began with handshakes and false hospitality ends with a child stolen from a riverbank. Jack Marston is taken in broad daylight, lured away by a woman with a kind voice and a lie about his mother. One moment he is playing with Arthur, talking about adventures and outlaws and the world beyond camp. The next, his fishing pole lies abandoned in the grass. For Dutch, this is more than an insult. It is an attack on his philosophy, on the idea that this gang is in the truest sense a family he can protect from civilization's cruelty. The trap is elegant and cruel. A taunting note. A carriage at the manor. Hosea urges caution, but Dutch is already burning. The old ways were dying, and he refuses to be humiliated by plantation aristocrats who own their power on paper. So the gang saddles up in the dead of night, a column of horses and lanterns cutting through the southern mist, riding straight toward Braithwaite Manor with guns ready and hearts pounding. The assault is a march through hell. Fire blooms against the night as torches hit dry wood and old curtains. Arthur storms the front steps with Bill and Javier, bullets shattering windows, the great house screaming with alarm. Room to room, corridor to corridor, he moves through smoke and splinters, a living embodiment of the gang's rage. Servants flee, Braithwaite's sons die in stairwells. And the walls that once held balls and banquets now echo with gunfire and choking coughs. Through it all, Arthur's mind keeps circling back to Jack. Not the ransom, not the insult, just the boy who asked if outlaws could be good men. He has been Dutch's enforcer from the very beginning, the fist that makes the speeches real. But here, something shifts. Protecting John's family, shielding Jack behind his horse, calming Abigail's terror, these become his quiet rebellions against the blood Dutch keeps demanding. How can this be about freedom if the smallest and most innocent are never safe? Dutch stands before the burning manor and calls it justice. He tells them this is what happens when the rich steal from the poor, when aristocrats think they can toy with free men. Fire and blood are framed as another step towards some promised future, another necessary cruelty on the road out of a dying world. Yet in the glow of the flames, the gang's moral line blurs beyond recognition. Is this vengeance or vanity? Then Catherine Braithwaite delivers the final wound. Jack is gone. Sold off, traded away, sent to a man in Saint Denis. The manor collapses behind them, but the real collapse is ahead. To chase one child, they will ride into the city that will break them, and Arthur's next chance to escape this fate will be waiting in those bright, merciless streets. But first, the gang has to survive Saint Denis at all. Saint Denis is the first place that truly makes the Vanderlinde Gang feel small. The world was changing, and the city is its brightest, cruelest proof. Electric lights burn away the shadows they used to hide in, factories roar through the night, and streetcars rattle past crowds who barely notice a handful of outlaws riding in from the swamps. From its humble beginnings as a trading port, Saint Denis has become the living embodiment of the new America Dutch claims to hate. Smokestacks instead of pine trees, brick alleys instead of canyons, bankers and politicians instead of cattle barons and stagecoaches. Their old tricks still work on backwater sheriffs and feuding families, but here, surrounded by telegraph wires and police whistles, the gang's frontier theatrics feel slow, loud, and exposed. Dutch refuses to be intimidated. If the frontier is closing, he will conquer the city instead. He starts talking about influence, about using men like Angelo Bronte, about playing the rich against one another in parlors instead of on dusty streets. It sounds impressive. It sounds modern. It is, in the truest sense, a story of ambition outrunning understanding. Dutch believes he can read Saint Denis the way he once read a small-town marshal. But behind every mayor, banker, and crime boss now stand rail companies, newspapers, and the Pinkertons, watching and waiting. Arthur feels it first in his bones. The noise never stops, the air tastes of coal and sewage, and every corner swarms with strangers' eyes. A man who could disappear into a blizzard or a forest now feels watched in broad daylight. He moves through markets and boulevards like a bear on a ballroom floor, powerful but misplaced, and the city turns his unease into doubt. If this is civilization, what chance does Dutch's wandering philosophy really have? Hosea sees the same thing, but where Arthur feels it, Hosea tries to name it. To him, Saint Denis is not just a place, it is the proof that the old ways were dying. He warns Dutch that men like Bronte write the rules here, that the gang is walking into a game where loyalty means nothing, and betrayal is business. Hosea suggests smaller scores, quieter exits, even the possibility of disappearing before the noose tightens. Dutch smiles, nods, and then reaches higher. The pattern interrupt comes quietly. For the first time since Blackwater, Dutch begins to speak of one enormous, elegant job in the city itself, the bank. One vault, one night, one last robbery to buy their freedom from this tightening web of civilization. To the gang, exhausted and grieving, it sounds like salvation. To Arthur, staring at marble pillars and armed guards, it feels like a bad echo of the ferry. Hosea hesitates, studies blueprints, tries to slow the momentum, but the decision is already made. The St. Denis Bank will not just be another score, it will be the hinge of the entire story. The beginning of the end for Dutch's idealistic dream, for Hosea's quiet guidance, and for Arthur's last, fragile chances to walk away. The city has accepted them. Now it will devour them. Dutch sells the St. Denis job as salvation, not just a score, but the score, the final, glorious act that will buy their freedom and prove that his philosophy still means something in a world that has stopped listening. In his mind, the bank is not a building. It is a stage. From its humble beginnings, the gang robbed trains and coaches and riverboats. But this is different. This is the beating heart of civilization, the polished marble and iron bars that hold the money of railroads, oilmen, and politicians. Dutch tells them that one decisive blow here will erase Blackwater, erase the ferry, erase the slow erosion of loyalty and faith that has been eating at the gang since the very beginning. Hosea does not believe him. Hosea has seen too many miracles turn to funerals. He walks the St. Denis streets, watches the Pinkertons posted at corners, studies the patrols around the trolley station, and feels the weight of the city pressing in. Arthur feels it too, the way the law watches them, the way Angelo Bronte smiles too easily, the way the world was changing while Dutch still speaks as if the old ways were dying only for everyone else. Their instincts scream that the timing is too perfect. The offer, the blueprints, the promise of an easy escape by boat, all handed to them by men whose fortunes depend on order, not chaos. Hosea argues for smaller jobs, for disappearing into the bayou, for one last season in the wilderness before the noose tightens. Dutch hears the words, but not the warning. He is chasing not just money now, but his own legend. The night of the heist, everything seems to validate Dutch's dream. The disguises work, the lobby falls quiet under the weight of Arthur's shotgun and Dutch's voice, and the gang moves with a precision earned over decades. Down in the vault, the drills bite into steel, bonds and bills spill into bags, and for a few breathless minutes it feels in the truest sense like the gang has turned back time. Then the hinges of the story snap. The power cuts. The lights die. And the Pinkertons arrive not as a reaction, but as an audience that has been waiting for the curtain to rise. Above, Hosea is seized in the chaos, dragged before Dutch and Arthur, and executed in the street as a message. The living embodiment of Dutch's better nature is silenced with a single shot. On the rooftops, Lenny, the bright, idealistic young outlaw who still believed in Dutch's dreams, is gunned down before Arthur can even finish calling his name. The escape turns into a slaughter, the family into scattered fugitives clinging to gutters and alley shadows while St. Denis erupts around them. This is one of the clearest almost survivals in the entire story. If Dutch had listened to Hosea, if he had settled for smaller robberies, if he had valued survival over spectacle, the gang might have limped away, broken but alive. Instead, in one night, the heart, the future, and the last real chance at freedom are all torn out. Arthur escapes on a boat, not as a victor, but as a man carried helplessly toward the next disaster, watching the ashes of his family drift across the harbor. The bank job should have saved them. It proves, beyond doubt, that Dutch cannot save anyone, not even himself. And from that moment on, every plan grows darker, every promise thinner, and every path out for Arthur more narrow than the last. The boat does not carry them to salvation. It carries them into exile. When the survivors of St. Denis stagger onto that ship, they are not escaping their problems. Their problems are simply changing the horizon. A storm answers Dutch's last great lie. The sea tears the vessel apart, smashing the gang's dreams against rock and reef, and in the chaos Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and a few others are thrown into the water and spat out onto a foreign shore. They do not land in some promised West. They wake on Guarma, an island far from America, far from Blackwater, far from the Pinkertons, yet somehow pressed under the same invisible weight. From its humble beginnings, this was always a story of running toward freedom and crashing into reality. Guarma is beautiful in the truest sense, and deadly in the most practical one. Lush jungles steam under a punishing sun, parrots flash through the canopy, and white beaches curve around turquoise coves that could belong on a postcard from a better world. But behind those trees stand sugar plantations run by brutal overseers, guarded by hired guns, feeding a corrupt export empire. The island is already at war with itself, enslaved workers and revolutionaries plotting to overthrow a tyrant, soldiers hunting them down. Even here, where the world was changing along different lines, the old ways were dying under the boots of profit and gunpowder. Dutch sees it and smiles. Another stage. Another audience for his philosophy. He inserts himself into the island's revolution, promising aid, trading Vanderlinde guns for passage home, turning a local struggle into yet another mirror for his ego. To the rebels, he is a foreign ally. To Dutch, they are pieces on a board he never intends to stay and defend. Is there any war he will not claim as his own, so long as someone else bleeds for it? For Arthur, Guarma is not an adventure. It is a fever dream. He staggers through the jungle, clothes soaked, lungs burning, the first real hints of sickness tightening their grip. Every fight leaves him more winded. Every march leaves him more hollow. His body is failing, and as he watches Dutch barter, lives with plantation owners and revolutionaries alike. Something else fails too, the last fragile belief that this man is still the living embodiment of the ideals he preached. Guarma should be a clean break. New land, new cause, no Pinkertons in sight. Instead, the same patterns repeat. Dutch overpromises, underdelivers, and leaves bodies behind as payment. Javier and Bill follow out of habit and fear. Arthur follows because he has nowhere else to go. How many times can an outlaw outrun civilization when the real pursuit is coming from inside his own camp? When they finally claw their way back to the mainland, they do not return as reborn men. They return as ghosts. Months have passed. The gang has scattered. The world has moved on without them. Arthur steps off that boat coughing, thinner, weaker, carrying an illness he does not yet understand and a dread he cannot quite name. Because if Guarma was the false escape, what happens when there are no escapes left? Arthur comes back from Guarma breathing, but not truly living. The island did not kill him with bullets or knives. It sent something slower, quieter, the living embodiment of a curse that turns every future choice into a countdown. At first, it is only a cough, a hand to the mouth after a long ride, a rough breath at the end of a gunfight, dismissed as exhaustion and bad weather. But the days grow colder, and the cough grows deeper. He starts losing weight, his broad frame hollowing out, clothes hanging looser, face sharpening into something gaunt and unfamiliar. The world around him seems heavier, sounds muffled, colors dulled, as if civilization itself is pushing him to the edges of the frame. The gang notices, and then pretends not to. Dutch talks of freedom and plans. Micah sneers. Hosea is gone. The campfire stories continue, but Arthur sits a little further back, shoulders hunched, staring into the dark. From its humble beginnings, this family had promised him a place to belong. Now even breathing feels borrowed. The collapse comes in Saint Denis. One debt, one beating, one desperate man, named Thomas Downs, coughing blood into Arthur's face months earlier, returns as a bill that cannot be dodged. Arthur staggers in the street, vision swimming, lungs seizing. In a city that worships progress, an outlaw falls to his knees on a busy sidewalk, and no one truly stops to help. The doctor's office is small, quiet, almost gentle, a strange sanctuary in a noisy world. The tests are simple, a stethoscope against a failing chest, a request for a deep breath that Arthur cannot give, a handkerchief stained red. No grand drama, no gunfire, just a man in a clean coat delivering a verdict with clinical detachment. Tuberculosis, in that era, in that place, it is not a diagnosis. It is a sentence. Arthur's reaction moves in jagged steps. First shock, a stunned silence as if the words do not belong to him. Then denial, the outlaw instinct insisting he has survived worse, that this is another fight to be won. But the doctor's calm certainty, the weight of the cough, the ache in his bones, all press down until there is only grim acceptance. His time is limited. His dreams of riding off into some distant sunset were delusions all along. From that moment, every mission becomes an almost survival. Every robbery, every rescue, every betrayal he witnesses is framed by the ticking clock in his chest. He cannot outrun this enemy. He can only decide how to meet it. Does he cling to Dutch's failing philosophy or turn toward John, Abigail, and Jack, trying to salvage a different future from the ruins? In the truest sense, this is where Arthur becomes both unsavable and finally free. His body is condemned, but his choices are not. The old ways were dying, but perhaps something better can live through John. So the question hangs over every ride, every gunshot, every fading breath. Is this the end of Arthur Morgan, or the moment his story begins to survive without him? From that moment in the doctor's office, Arthur's story of survival stops being about bullets and passes and starts being about honor, guilt, and ghosts. Tuberculosis gives him a deadline, and with it, a terrible kind of clarity. The man who once rode headlong into gunfire for Dutch now has to ride back through his own past. Through every debt collected, every face beaten bloody in the name of a philosophy that promised freedom and delivered chains. He remembers Thomas Downes coughing blood into his face, begging for mercy while Arthur followed orders. He remembers Cornwall's men gunned down on train tracks, innocent guards executed in the street at Saint Denis, families ruined so the gang could keep chasing Dutch's dreams. From its humble beginnings as an idealistic crusade against a rigged civilization, the Vanderlinde vision has become the living embodiment of the very cruelty it claimed to resist. Arthur starts to see that the world was changing, but Dutch refused to change with it. That realization shifts where Arthur's loyalty points. He does not suddenly stop caring about the gang, but his gaze narrows, hardens, and settles on John, Abigail, and Jack. In the truest sense, they become his last real plan. John, the former Proch Dutch left to rot in Sisika. Abigail, who has spent years begging these men to put family above robbery. Jack, born into a campfire fairy tale about freedom, raised in the shadow of Gunsmoke. If Arthur cannot live, maybe they can. If his body is condemned, perhaps their future is his almost survival. The game's honor system turns that inner struggle into visible consequence. Every act of mercy or brutality, every decision to help a stranger or rob them blind, becomes more than a mechanic. It becomes a mirror. Arthur's reputation changes how townsfolk greet him, how gang members confide in him, how the world reacts to his presence. More importantly, it changes how he talks about himself in those late-night conversations, when the fire is low and the old ways were dying in his eyes long before his lungs give out. He starts riding out of his way to rescue a nun on a train platform, to help war veterans, to protect a widow learning to shoot. He can choose to spare enemies, to forgive those who insult him, to give away hard-earned money to people who will never know his name. Each time he pushes back against Dutch's spiraling delusions, questioning the Tahiti plan, defending John, refusing to abandon the Marstons, it is another tiny, stubborn, almost survival of his soul. His body weakens, his conscience wakes up. All of this leads toward a final reckoning. Honor will not cure his lungs, but it will decide what his last ride feels like. Will Arthur die as just another lost soul crushed beneath progress, or as a man who at the very end managed to drag his story a few inches toward redemption? The answer waits on that last mountain, where Dutch, Micah, and John will force his philosophy to take its final shape. That final mountain does not appear out of nowhere. The road to it is paved in whispers, in glances, in the slow poisoning of a man who once called Arthur and John his sons. After Guarma, when the gang crawls back into the world half-starved and half-mad, Dutch does not reach for the familiar voices that steadied him from the very beginning. He reaches for Micah Bell. In the ruins of Saint Denis and the swamps of Shady Bell, Dutch had already begun to fracture. But in Beaver Hollow, after Hosea's death and Guarma's chaos, Micah becomes the living embodiment of the path Dutch now prefers: ruthless, decisive, allergic to doubt. When plans fail, Micah does not ask why. He asks who to blame, who to hurt, who to hang from a tree. For a leader drowning in guilt he refuses to name, that is a comforting philosophy. Arthur watches the shift with growing unease. Once, Dutch would turn to Hosea for caution and to Arthur for execution, balancing dreams with reality, freedom with the creeping reach of civilization. Now, campfires that used to hold open debates become private councils between Dutch and Micah, conducted in low tones at the edge of the firelight. Arthur sees them step away together after every setback. He sees Dutch return angrier, more certain that betrayal, not bad judgment, is their real enemy. Micah feeds that paranoia with practiced ease. He suggests that John's injuries and absences are not misfortune, but desertion. He hints that Arthur's new concern for women, children, and debtors is weakness, that illness has turned the gang's most feared gun into a bleeding heart. How many times does he lean in and say that someone ain't with us no more, that the old ways were dying because the old guard lost their nerve? The story of the gang's collapse becomes, in Dutch's mind, a story of cowards and traitors, not of his own delusions. Specific choices mark the betrayal. Dutch leaves John to rot on the Sisika job, dismissing rescue as a distraction until it suits Micah's plans. He abandons Arthur in the chaos of St. Denis, fleeing with Micah while Hosea and Lenny die. Later, when Arthur pleads to help the Wapiti or to walk away from Colm's noose, Dutch chooses Micah's brutal solutions over the ghost of Hosea's counsel every time. Where Hosea once said, "Live smart," Micah says, "Hit harder." Dutch listens to the voice that requires no self-reflection. In Micah, Arthur sees a dark mirror. Both men are killers, both raised in an outlaw family, both fluent in violence. But as Arthur's sickness forces him to reckon with what his life has meant, he starts seeking redemption in the truest sense: small mercies, hard truths, a future for John. Micah moves in the opposite direction, embracing cruelty as freedom, offering Dutch a world where the gang's crimes are proof of strength, not sins to answer for. This is another almost survival hiding in plain sight. If Dutch had trusted Arthur's warnings over Micah's poison, if he had heard the man he called son instead of the viper at his ear, the end might still have come, but perhaps not in a hail of bullets and accusations. Arthur's last days might have been spent beside family, not chasing a rat up a mountain. Yet Dutch keeps choosing. Micah keeps whispering. And in the shadows of Beaver Hollow, one final fatal plan is already taking shape. In that darkness under Beaver Hollow, as Dutch drifts further toward Micah's poison, Arthur quietly turns towards something else: John's second chance. The gang is collapsing, the philosophy is rotting, and yet, in the midst of betrayal and paranoia, Arthur begins to fix his eyes on one man who might still walk away. From the very beginning of 1899, John Marston is already marked as unreliable. He disappears after Blackwater, wounded and ashamed, trying to find Abigail and Jack and failing. When he finally staggers back at Coulter, half frozen and apologetic, Dutch welcomes him with a speech about family and loyalty, but the seed of doubt is planted. Micah waters it at every turn, reminding Dutch that John ran, that John chose his own skin over the gang. In a story of outlaw honor and shifting allegiances, John becomes the convenient example of what not to be. Arthur believes it, at first. This is the man who helped raise John from his humble beginnings as a teenage thief, who watched Dutch mold him into a surrogate son. To see that son vanish during the gang's worst moment feels like betrayal. Arthur's early conversations carry that resentment. He calls John a coward, questions his commitment, treats his absence as proof that the old ways were dying and the younger generation had gone soft. But the world was changing, and so was Arthur. Rhodes, Jack's kidnapping, and the St. Denis disaster tear open his illusions. John's supposed unreliability begins to look less like weakness and more like clarity. John wants to protect Abigail and Jack. He wants a ranch, a quiet life, a future beyond Dutch's endless schemes. In the truest sense, that desire for a small, honest freedom is the healthiest instinct in the entire camp. Once Arthur's diagnosis of tuberculosis strips away his own delusions of invincibility, his tone with John shifts. On the ride back from Sisika, in the muddy paths around Shady Bell, and finally in the choking air of Beaver Hollow, Arthur stops demanding John's loyalty and starts demanding his escape. He tells him outright to take Abigail and Jack and run, to stop chasing Dutch's dreams and start living his own. Dutch is no longer a father. He is a storm. The gang is no longer a family, it is a sinking ship. Here lies the cruel irony. Arthur can see the path clearly for John, but not for himself. He is bound by decades of loyalty to Dutch, by guilt over his past crimes, by a failing body that convinces him his own future is already spent. So he pours everything into John's survival, as if John's escape might redeem his own almost life. Is Arthur, in those final pleas, trying to save John, or is he trying to send the better part of himself riding over a horizon he will never reach? That question hangs over every choice that follows, as Dutch's last plan unfolds and Arthur is forced to decide how far he will go to make John's second chance real. That decision, Arthur throwing his remaining strength behind John, collides almost immediately with the reality of the final camp. Beaver Hollow is not a home, it is a pressure cooker. The gang's last refuge is a maze of dark caves and damp clearings where whispers travel faster than gunshots, and every shadow seems to hold a Pinkerton, an O'Driscoll, or a traitor. By this point, the atmosphere is poisonous. Supplies go missing, and no one admits who took them. Conversations stop the second certain boots crunch into view. One fire belongs to those who still cling to Dutch's philosophy, insisting the next score will fix everything. Another belongs to those who stare into the embers and see only endings. Even the way people sit tells the story. Micah's men close, armed and loud, while others, Tilly, Mary Beth, Pearson, edge toward the fringes, already half gone in their minds. Dutch feels it. The man who once charmed saloons into silence now repeats himself, circling the same phrases about freedom, about civilization closing in, about one last job that will make the world right again. The speeches grow longer even as their impact shrinks. He raises his voice more, but sounds smaller. The old ways were dying, and he refuses to admit that his own dream is one of them. His rhetoric becomes the living embodiment of fear. Every doubt is treason. Every question is betrayal. When Arthur confronts him about the Tahiti fantasy, about the bodies piling up, about abandoning John in St. Denis, Dutch does not argue the facts, he attacks the loyalty. How dare Arthur, of all people, question him now? How dare the boy he raised stand there and suggest the very beginning might have gone wrong somewhere along the way? Around them, the fractures turn into open breaks. Tilly watches the shouting from a distance, quietly planning her exit, already imagining a life where the word family does not mean hunger and gunpowder. Mary Beth withdraws into her notebooks, her stories becoming escape routes on paper while she waits for a chance to make them real. Their rebellion is not loud, but it is final. Micah, on the other hand, thrives in the chaos. He mocks hesitation, calls out cowards and traitors, and positions himself as Dutch's last true believer. When Arthur challenges Dutch, Micah steps forward, hand near his gun, daring anyone to take Arthur's side. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, played out around a dying campfire. What haunts this camp most is not who is there, but who is not. Hosea's absence hangs over every argument. Without him, there is no one who can cut through Dutch's paranoia with a quiet word and a shared memory from its humble beginnings. Arthur tries to fill that role, to be the voice of reason and restraint, but Dutch only hears accusation where Hosea once delivered counsel. In the truest sense, the gang has lost its conscience. This is the last almost survival of the Vanderlinde family. If, in this miserable hollow, they had chosen to walk away from Dutch together, splintering, scattered, but alive, how many would have escaped the final bloodbath? How many futures die here, not in a hail of bullets, but in the choice to follow a leader who has already abandoned them? The world was changing, and the camp at Beaver Hollow is where the gang refuses that change one last time. The next moves will not just decide who lives and dies. They will decide what, if anything, of this outlaw family's soul survives beyond Arthur's final ride. Beaver Hollow is where the gang clings to its dying dream, but Arthur's reckoning begins far from the firelight, in the mud and misery he once helped create. For all Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization, the most brutal judgment on their philosophy waits not in a Pinkerton rifle, but in a broken farmhouse outside Annisburg. After the diagnosis, after the doctor quietly names the disease that is already hollowing him out, Arthur rides to the Downs place. From the very beginning, that debt was presented as routine gang business, a simple collection for Strauss. Now it stands revealed as the living embodiment of everything their story of rebellion has rotted into. Thomas Downs is gone, dead of tuberculosis. His widow Edith and their son Archie are still there, barely surviving, huddled against a world that never cared. The last time Arthur came here, he dragged Thomas into the mud, beat him while the man coughed blood into his face, and rode away without a second thought. Now he walks through the same yard slower, shoulders lower, each step a confession. The disease that is killing him came from that beating, from that moment of cruelty in the service of a dream already collapsing. The old ways were dying, but the gang kept pretending the cost belonged to someone else. Arthur offers money. He offers an apology that feels too small against a grave that cannot be dug up and undone. Edith spits back years of humiliation and terror, reminding him that Dutch's family left her real family starving and shunned. Archie stares with the wary hatred of a child who has learned that outlaws do not ride in as heroes. They ride in as a storm that never leaves. Arthur sees, in the truest sense, that his violence did not just stain his own soul. It echoed outward, warping lives he barely remembered. This is not the only reckoning. In Saint Denis, old acquaintances call him a brute and a thug, not a revolutionary. In side roads and back alleys, strangers remember being robbed, beaten, abandoned when Dutch's plans moved on. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, leaves behind widows, orphans, and men who never healed right. Even abandoned missions return as rumors and resentments, proof that the gang's legend is built on other people's ruins. These confrontations do not fix anything. Thomas Downs stays dead. Edith and Archie remain poor. The past refuses to offer clean absolution. But Arthur's priorities shift. He stops arguing about Dutch's next grand robbery and starts quietly helping John, warning him to leave, slipping money to those the gang broke. He cannot save his body, but he can almost become the man Dutch always claimed he was, a protector instead of a predator, if only for a handful of final choices. The tragedy is simple. He almost survives himself. Yet, as his world narrows and his time runs out, another question rises. When a lost soul finally turns toward the light, how far will Dutch and Micah go to drag him back into the dark? Arthur's turn toward the light meets its cruelest test, not on a mountain or in a gunfight, but on the side of a roaring train. It is here that the philosophy Dutch preached from the very beginning finally collides with the man he has become. The mission begins as so many Vanderlinde schemes do, bold, theatrical, and doomed. Dutch sells it as one last big score, a train job that will set the family free, a story of risk and reward in a world closing in. The gang rides hard, boards the cars under fire, and for a moment the old rhythm returns. Dutch calls the shots, Arthur and John move in tandem, and the dream of freedom almost feels real again. Then John is thrown from the train. The impact is brutal. He vanishes in the chaos, swallowed by dust and gunfire. Arthur, the living embodiment of Dutch's old ideals, wants to turn back. He shouts, pushes, demands they go for John. This is the man Dutch once called a son, the boy raised around those same campfires, fed on the same speeches about loyalty and family. Dutch does not turn back. Calm, almost cold, he insists there is no time, no way, no sense in risking everyone for one man. Sacrifices must be made. He frames it as hard necessity, as the price of survival in a world where the old ways were dying. Yet the decision lands not as leadership, but as betrayal. Arthur's reaction is immediate and raw. Disbelief first. Then anger. Then a dawning horror that this is not a momentary lapse, but a revelation. The Dutch who once rode into gunfire to pull Arthur out now leaves John bleeding in the dirt. In the truest sense, the man who preached family has chosen the score over his own son. Micah moves fast to seal that choice. He mutters that John was getting weak, that he had been distant, that a man thinking about ranches and wives and children cannot be trusted in an outlaw world. He paints John as disloyal, soft, already halfway gone. It is gaslighting a strategy, turning Dutch's doubts into doctrine and isolating Arthur one careful sentence at a time. Here the gang's campfire philosophy finally collapses. Arthur still rides with Dutch, but something fundamental has broken. His loyalty shifts, quietly but decisively, toward John's family, toward Abigail and Jack, toward the fragile chance that at least one branch of this broken family tree might escape civilization's noose. And the haunting question lingers. If Dutch had turned that train around, if he had chosen loyalty over survival, could the family have held together long enough for Arthur's redemption to become more than an almost? But Dutch's train never really turned around. It just kept racing toward a horizon made of mangoes and warm ocean air, a paradise that only ever existed in his voice. From the very beginning of the collapse, through Coulter's blizzards, Rhodes' funerals, and St. Denis' choking streets, Dutch kept returning to the same refrain. Tahiti, mangoes, a little farm where the gang could live free, beyond the reach of civilization and Pinkerton law. He spoke of it with the certainty of scripture, repeating the dream so often that it stopped sounding like a plan and started sounding like a spell he was casting on himself. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. But Dutch clung to this one bright picture as if repetition alone could hold back history. Arthur's relationship to that fantasy traces a story of belief curdling into disillusionment. At first, as a young outlaw saved from the gallows by Dutch and Hosea, he accepted it in the truest sense. If Dutch said there was a place where their family could live in peace, then there was. Dutch had already taken a lost soul and given him purpose, so why not a tropical future as well? Tahiti was just the next extension of an idealistic philosophy that promised freedom to those brave enough to seize it. But each failure carved away Arthur's faith. After Blackwater, after Hosea's death, after the St. Denis Bank shattered the gang's illusion of control, Tahiti began to sound different in his ears. First, it drew a quiet skepticism, a sidelong glance, a weary maybe instead of eager agreement. Then, as Dutch's plans grew bloodier and more erratic, it drew open contempt. Arthur came to see the island not as a destination, but as a lie Dutch told himself as much as everyone else, a shield against admitting that the dream had rotted. Yet not everyone let it go. Javier still talked about the islands with a kind of desperate loyalty. Bill grumbled but followed. And even John, for a time, clung to the hope that one last job might really buy Jack a better world. Faced with the terrifying reality that there might be no safe place left for people like them, some chose the beautiful lie over the empty horizon. Was it cowardice, or the only way they knew to keep walking? Dutch understood that power. He wielded Tahiti as a tool, promising that just one more score, one more risk, would finally earn their ticket out. From the trolley station in St. Denis to the madness of Guarma and the blood-soaked mines and mansions that followed, every escalation was framed as the final step before freedom. Yet each final step only buried them deeper in betrayal, debt, and death. In that sense, Tahiti becomes a psychological almost survival for Arthur. It represents the life he could have lived if Dutch's philosophy had ever truly matched his actions. A small farm, honest work, a family protected rather than exploited. From its humble beginnings as an idealistic dream to its end as an obvious delusion, Tahiti is the living embodiment of everything that might have been. A paradise of words, never of reality, against which Arthur's last, more grounded hope for John will soon be measured. But before Arthur can measure that hope for John, the gang itself begins to tear in two. The dream of Tahiti fades, and in its place rises something uglier, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family turning on itself in the mud of Beaver Hollow. The confrontations between Arthur and Micah do not begin with guns drawn. They begin with words. In the very beginning, it is snide remarks by the fire, sideways accusations about who really botched St. Denis, who really talks to the Pinkertons. Micah calls Arthur weak, sentimental, too attached to the women and children. Arthur calls Micah reckless, cruel, poison. Each argument becomes a small trial, held in front of a camp that no longer knows what justice looks like. As the tension builds, the accusations sharpen. Micah paints himself as the loyal soldier, the one man still willing to go all the way for Dutch's philosophy of freedom against civilization. Arthur, coughing blood into his hand, stands there and calls him what he is, a rat, a man who thrives on chaos and whispers in the dark. When he demands to know who told Milton about the Blackwater money, the question hangs over the camp like smoke. Who truly betrayed this family? Dutch stands at the center of it, and yet somehow stands nowhere at all. His indecision becomes its own verdict. He drifts toward Micah not because he trusts him, but because Micah offers the one thing Dutch cannot give himself anymore: reassurance. Micah tells him he is still right, still the living embodiment of resistance, Still the brilliant outlaw mind outsmarting a corrupt world. Arthur, by contrast, forces him to look at the bodies, the burned bridges, the children crying in the night. Which voice is easier to believe? Around them, the others fracture. Javier, Bill, and some of the newer recruits lean toward Dutch and Micah, clinging to the old ways that are clearly dying. Charles, Sadie, and the women of the camp watch Arthur with worried eyes. Sensing that his version of reality hurts more but rings truer, many are simply afraid. They want to survive. They want the shooting to stop. How do they choose between a leader they once worshipped and the man now calling that leader lost? This is where Arthur's courage cuts through the haze. Sick, exhausted, fully aware that crossing Micah makes him a target, he refuses to be silent. He calls Dutch out, not as a monster, but as a man who has lost his way and chosen flattery over truth. In the truest sense, this is the gang's last almost survival as a community. If they had united against Micah, if Dutch had chosen Arthur's hard truth over Micah's easy praise, could the endgame have been different? The answer to that question will be written in blood on the final night. When choosing sides is no longer a debate by the fire, but a gun drawn in the dark. That gun drawn in the dark becomes a line in the sand, and from that moment on, Arthur Morgan is riding on borrowed time. The gang's last almost survival as a community shatters, and a different story takes over. A story of one dying outlaw trying to make sure someone else lives. By the final chapter, Arthur is the living embodiment of what Dutch's dream has cost. His frame is gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. Every cough tears through him, wet and ragged, sometimes bringing blood to his hand as he steadies himself against a tree or the side of his horse. Even staying in the saddle is a battle. His shoulders slumping, his breath short. Yet, in the truest sense, his mind has never been clearer. The illusions are gone. Dutch's philosophy, once a blazing banner of freedom and family, now looks thin against the reality of Pinkerton rifles and Micah's whispered poison. When word comes that Abigail has been taken by the Pinkertons, Arthur faces a choice that would have been unthinkable from its humble beginnings. He can cling to Dutch, chase one more doomed plan, one more pile of money that might buy a future that no longer exists. Or he can ride into the jaws of civilization's new order to save the woman who anchors John's world. He chooses Abigail. He chooses John. He chooses a dangerous mission for someone else's family over his own survival, over the hollow loyalty that Dutch keeps demanding. The ride with John to rescue her is not just another job. It is quietly their last confession. Two men who once tried to rob each other under Dutch's amused eye now ride side by side through a dying West, talking about the past, about what might have been, about the old ways that are slipping away. Arthur pushes through his coughing fits, waves off John's concern, and keeps circling back to the same point. John must leave. John must do what Arthur never did. Walk away before the gang, before the dream, finishes eating him alive. On that road, Arthur stops being Dutch's enforcer and becomes John's guardian. The center of the story shifts. Dutch's grand rebellion fades into the background, and the camera, in every sense, begins to follow John's potential future instead of Dutch's collapsing mythology. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur finally understands his place in that change, not as the hero who escapes, but as the man who clears a path. This is the quiet pattern interrupt beneath the gunfire. Every step into the Pinkerton stronghold, every labored breath as they fight their way out with Abigail, is really preparation for another, final decision. Soon, on the mountain, Arthur will face a last fork in the road, help John escape or go back for the money. Survival of the soul, or survival of the dream. Which kind of survival truly matters? The answer waits at the summit, where the air is thin, the horses are tired, and there is no room left for delusions. The answer comes with gunfire. Pinkertons descend on Beaver Hollow not as lawmen, but as executioners, turning the forest into a killing ground. The old ways were dying, and the federal government had brought the final argument in rifles and Gatling guns. Smoke chokes the camp, that once promised freedom, as Arthur, lungs already ruined, drags himself into the open and fights through wave after wave. Every shot he fires buys seconds, not safety. Every breath sounds like it might be his last. This is not a daring escape or a clever ruse. It is a rout. Men who once rode as legends fall in the mud. trampled by horses, or cut down on the same ground where they once laughed around the fire. In the chaos, the Vanderlinde Gang stops being a gang and becomes a scattering of terrified individuals, each trying to survive the collapse of a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family turning on itself. Arthur's body fails, but his purpose sharpens. He drags John through the bullets, forces him toward the horses, and together they carve a bloody path out of Beaver Hollow. Behind them, Dutch's philosophy burns with the tents and wagons. Ahead of them, the mountains rise, cold and indifferent, promising only a hard road and harder choices. The climb toward the summit is both escape and reckoning. Dutch, Micah, Arthur, and John converge on the cliffs and, in some paths, the dark, choking tunnels of the mine. Here the Pinkertons are only half the danger. The real battle is between men who once called each other family. Accusations fly faster than bullets. Who betrayed whom? Who sold out the dream? Who turned a band of idealistic outlaws into a death march? Arthur finally names the rat, Micah, the man who appeared after Blackwater, who whispered in Dutch's ear, who always seemed to know too much. Arthur lays out the pattern, the timing, the convenient disasters. It is, in the truest sense, the world revealing itself as it really is, rather than how Dutch imagined it to be. But Dutch hesitates. Torn between the son from its humble beginnings and the new confidant who feeds his pride, he cannot fully choose. His eyes flicker from Arthur's ravaged face to Micah's smug defiance, and the silence between those looks is more violent than any gunshot. That is the moment the Vanderlinde family truly dies. Years of shared robberies, shared fires, shared losses collapse into shouted truths and bitter quiet. Dutch's grand philosophy is exposed as a refuge for a lost soul who cannot admit defeat. John sees it. Arthur feels it. Micah exploits it. When the gunsmoke finally thins, the gang is finished. Dutch walks away into the haze, Micah survives by venom and luck, and Arthur forces John toward the high trail. Their desperate ride into the mountains is not a victory, it is an evacuation. Behind them, only corpses, unfinished business, and apologies that will never be spoken. Ahead, a different ending waits, one last chance for survival of the soul. That different ending arrives on a narrow mountain trail, with the world collapsing behind them and dawn still a rumor on the horizon. The gunfire fades to echoes. The gang is gone. What remains is a single, brutal question that has been stalking Arthur Morgan from the very beginning. Money or mercy? The dream of one last score, or the fragile hope of one last act of grace? The game crystallizes that question into a tangible fork in the road. As Arthur and John scramble up the rocks, Dutch's plan has finally, definitively, failed. The camp is overrun, the Pinkertons are closing in, and years of promises about Tahiti, about freedom, about one final haul have turned to ash. Then comes the choice. Ride on with John, to secure his escape and his family's future, or turn back toward the camp, toward the cave stuffed with the gang's money. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions compressed into a single button press. On the surface, it is a simple dilemma: help a friend or grab the cash. In truth, it is Arthur's entire life made visible. Going for the money means clinging to Dutch's old philosophy, that from its humble beginnings, the gang's robberies were always building toward a grand payoff that would buy eternal freedom from civilization. Riding with John means accepting that the old ways were dying long before the Pinkertons ever found Beaver Hollow, and that the only thing worth saving now is a broken man, his wife, and their child. Each path plays out differently, but the destination is the same. Arthur's lungs are ruined by tuberculosis, his body shredded by the night's wounds. There is no branch where he walks away healthy. If he turns back for the money, he staggers through the chaos, reaches the cave, and finds the gang's fortune in a world that has already decided he will never spend it. Micah confronts him, Dutch drifts in, and the entire dream dissolves into suspicion and blood on the rocks. If he rides with John, the tone shifts. Arthur becomes, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of sacrifice. He hauls John upward, covers his retreat, and buys time with the last of his strength, so that something of what he believes in can continue through John and Jack. His death is still tragic, still brutal, but it bends toward meaning rather than emptiness. So what is this final moment? Is it Arthur's last almost survival, where his body fails but his legacy slips past the noose? Or is it merely the least terrible outcome in a story doomed from Blackwater, or even from the cough that followed Thomas Downes home? The answer lingers in the mountains, waiting for the epilogue to decide what truly lived and what truly died with Arthur Morgan. The answer lingers in the mountains, because that is where Arthur's body finally fails him, while his will refuses to die. The Last Climb with Micah is not a duel between equals. It is a story of a dying outlaw dragging his disease-ridden lungs up a frozen ladder of rock, facing a man who is all brute strength and no conscience. Every step is paid for in blood and breath. Every punch is an argument against the inevitable. On that ridge, the fight is less a showdown and more a desperate attempt to buy time. Arthur is not really trying to win. He is trying to delay. To hold Micah in place long enough for John, for Abigail, for Jack, for some shred of future, to slip through the cracks of a collapsing world. Micah hammers him into the dirt, snarling, cursing, using the last remnants of Dutch's broken philosophy as a weapon. Arthur claws back, not as Dutch's proc, but as the living embodiment of everything Dutch claimed to believe, and then abandoned. And then Dutch arrives, revolver in hand, caught between the son he raised and the monster he empowered. This should be the moment of clarity. Instead, it becomes the final, quiet betrayal. Dutch circles them, voice trembling, unable or unwilling to truly choose. In the end, he does not pull the trigger for Micah or for Arthur. He simply walks away, boots crunching on the snow, leaving both men bleeding on the mountain. Loyalty dissolves into silence. Family becomes a ghost. From here, the world splits. High honor, low honor, sunrise, or suffocation. If Arthur has lived with some measure of honor, if he has chosen John over the money, the game grants him a death that almost feels like grace. After the struggle, after Dutch's abandonment, Arthur collapses on a ridge, watching the sky burn gold and red as the music swells into mournful acceptance. May I stand unshaken, and the quiet, exhausted lines he delivers turn his last breath into a kind of prayer. The old ways were dying, and in that light, Arthur finally becomes the man he wanted to be, not the weapon Dutch forged. If he chooses the money, or lives as a cruel, dishonorable brute, the ending curdles. Micah does not leave him to the sunrise. Micah finishes the job. The death is uglier, more brutal, stripped of poetry. No soft horizon, no lingering music, only the brutal logic of a world that answers selfishness with oblivion. Same mountain, same cough, different judgment. In the truest sense, Arthur's death is not an ending, but a hinge. From its humble beginnings with Dutch and Hosea to this frozen summit, his story bends the Vanderlinde saga toward what comes next. His warnings to John, his small mercies or cruelties, echo forward into a new timeline. John's survival, his ranch, his doomed grasp at freedom under a rising civilization. All of it grows from this moment where one man dies so another can almost live. The world was changing. Arthur does not see that future, but his choices shape it, and the epilogue will reveal exactly how much of him refuses to stay buried in that mountain snow. And in the silence after Arthur's last breath, the story does not end. It twists. It curdles. It hands the future, for a time, to the worst man left standing. Micah Bell walks away from that mountain. He survives the chaos at Beaver Hollow, slips through the Pinkertons and rides off with Dutch at his side and a cut of the money in his saddlebags. On paper, the rat wins. The man who betrayed the gang, poisoned its philosophy, and sold its secrets to civilization is the one who keeps breathing. What does survival mean when it belongs to a man like that? From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang was supposed to be a family. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, John. In the very beginning, they were bound by shared dreams of freedom, by an almost idealistic belief that outlaws could be better than the men in suits chasing them. Micah stands as the living embodiment of how far that dream falls. He has no real family, only accomplices. No loyalty, only leverage. His victory is to ride away with a broken Dutch whose words have lost their fire and whose eyes no longer convince anyone, not even himself. The world was changing, and Dutch, once a prophet of the old ways, is now reduced to Micah's shadow. Their camp in the years after Arthur's death is not a community but a hideout. No songs around the fire, no shared stories of a better tomorrow, only stolen cash, paranoid glances, and the constant knowledge that Pinkertons and bounty hunters are closing in. Micah lives as a permanent fugitive, not a legendary outlaw, clinging to a pile of money that cannot buy back respect, trust, or purpose. In the truest sense, his survival is hollow. Arthur dies on that ridge, but his memory refuses to stay buried. Every day Micah wakes up, Arthur's story remains unfinished, a question mark hanging over the snow-choked peaks. Who will answer for the betrayal? Who will speak for the man who tried, at the end, to set John free and salvage some fragment of the gang's battered soul? That is where the epilogue rides in. Years later, when John Marston tracks Micah into the mountains, the confrontation is more than a simple revenge killing. Each bullet John fires carries the weight of a dead mentor, of a lost soul who almost escaped his fate. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions finally colliding in the thin mountain air. Micah's last stand proves a simple truth. Survival without legacy is just delay. Arthur's body lies on the ridge, but his choices keep shaping the world, pushing John, Sadie, and even Dutch toward that final reckoning where the old ways were dying for good. Arthur dies on the ridge, but the story does not. His absence becomes a presence, a shadow that stretches across the years. And the game cuts forward into a quieter, harsher world where one man is still breathing because Arthur chose to let him go. The epilogue opens with John Marston no longer the notorious outlaw of wanted posters, but a ranch hand under an alias, moving cattle instead of robbing trains. From its humble beginnings on that scrubby, windswept ranch, this new life is deliberately small, long days of labor, short evenings with Abigail and Jack, and a constant, anxious hope that obscurity might be enough to keep civilization's lawmen away. John trades the roar of gunfire for the creak of fence posts and the lowing of cattle, trying to turn survival into something that resembles a future. Yet Arthur's voice is still there. In the truest sense, John is not alone in those fields. Every choice he makes is haunted by that final plea on the mountain to be better. John hesitates before reaching for a gun, pulls Jack in closer when danger passes by, and stumbles through awkward attempts at fatherhood that Arthur never truly mastered but desperately wanted for him. Where the gang once taught Jack how to hold a revolver, John now tries to teach him to read, echoing the way Dutch and Hosea once taught Arthur to see the world beyond pure violence. The game fills this new chapter with small, deliberate echoes. John wears Arthur's old satchel, uses his revolver, rides horses bought with money Arthur helped secure. Conversations with Sadie and Charles invoke Arthur's name with a mixture of grief and respect, as if speaking of a lost soul who tried, at the end, to drag them all toward a better path. Even the world responds differently depending on Arthur's honor. Strangers remember a rough man with a decent heart, or a brutal outlaw whose death felt overdue. In both versions, his shadow shapes how John is seen. But John's survival is not clean. He is still a man who solves problems with bullets, still drawn back toward violence by debts, threats, and the simple fact that the old ways were dying, but not dead yet. Every ranch job that turns into a gunfight, every compromise with Sadie's bounty hunting, reminds the viewer that this extended life is built on blood Arthur spilled and refused to spill. John is the living embodiment of Arthur's last philosophy, that if one man could walk away, perhaps the gang's story of loyalty and betrayal might mean something. So does Arthur survive here, through John and Jack, through a quiet ranch and a boy reading by lamplight? Or is that just a comforting illusion, a way to soften the blow of a man who died coughing on a mountaintop while civilization closed in? The answer lies in what John does next, and who comes looking for him when the past finally rides back into view. But that quiet ranch is not the same in every telling. In the truest sense, John's epilogue is a mirror, and what it reflects depends on the man who died on that mountain. Arthur's heartbeat is gone, yet his choices keep breathing through the people who remember him, through the doors that open for John, and the ones that slam shut. From the very beginning, Rockstar ties Arthur's honor to a web of futures that almost were. This is not just a story of one outlaw's redemption or damnation, but of a world subtly rewritten by mercy or cruelty. In one timeline, townsfolk nod to John with a trace of respect, because Arthur once rode through as a reluctant guardian. In another, the same streets feel colder, the same faces harder, as if civilization itself remembers the weight of Arthur's sins. Nowhere is that clearer than with the Downs family, the living embodiment of Arthur's disease and regret. When Arthur first beats Thomas Downs in the mud, the tuberculosis that will kill him passes in a single coughing breath. Later, if Arthur returns in kindness, helping Edith and Archie, the epilogue shows a family scarred but surviving, the boy growing into a man who can stand his ground. If Arthur abandoned them to despair, John instead finds bitterness, or finds nothing at all, as if the world quietly erased a branch of the story that might have helped him. The pattern repeats across the frontier. Side characters Arthur saved or spared become faint beacons in John's hardening life. A veteran Arthur helped in Saint Denis, a ranch hand he defended, a stranger he chose not to rob. These figures can reappear with warmer words, cheaper prices, or simple, hard-earned trust. They do not change the grand arc of history, but they change the texture of John's days, turning an endless struggle into a struggle with brief moments of grace. And when John meets those who suffered under Arthur's cruelty, the air tightens instead. Some are openly hostile, others simply gone. Their absence another ghost at Arthur's funeral. It becomes, almost quietly, a story of multiple worlds layered atop each other. One where Arthur's rare mercy leaves John a few more allies, a little more freedom, a softer landing when the old ways were dying. Another where Arthur's brutality echoes forward, leaving John more isolated, more hunted, even as the broad strokes remain the same. Ranch, revenge, tragedy. Through this design, Rockstar suggests that survival is not only measured in years. It is measured in how long a man's philosophy lingers after his body fails. Arthur almost survives in every handshake John receives, in every warning given instead of a bullet, in every family that endures, because he finally chose to be more than a lost soul. And when the past comes riding for John, the question is not just who he became, but which Arthur the world remembers. When the past finally rides up that mountain, it does not come wearing Arthur Morgan's face, but his shadow is in every footprint. The hunt for Micah Bell is not just John Marston chasing a traitor, it is the last echo of a promise made on a blood-soaked ridge, a story of loyalty and betrayal refusing to stay buried beneath the snow. Years have passed. John has a ranch, a family, a thin stake in civilization. On paper, he has everything Arthur begged him to choose. Yet Micah's name lingers like a sickness he never quite shook. It is revenge, yes, for the years of torment, for the betrayals in the mountains and in the mud. But it is also unfinished loyalty to Arthur, the living embodiment of a debt that can only be paid in one currency. John cannot truly close the Vanderlinde chapter of his life while the man who killed the gang from the inside still breathes. So the trail leads back into the high country, back where the world was changing and the old ways were dying. And once more a Vanderlinde gunman climbs toward a fortress of ice and gun smoke. John, Sadie, and Charles assault Micah's new gang in a brutal, methodical push through the snow, every step an echo of Arthur's last climb. Where Arthur dragged a failing body up that mountain, John advances with grim purpose, supported by the very people Arthur saved. It is, in the truest sense, Arthur's final plan being carried out by another man's hands. The firefight is vicious. Sadie is gutted, but refuses to fall quiet. Charles is wounded yet keeps moving, another lost soul refusing to let history repeat itself. The cabin becomes a killing ground, a place where the dreams and delusions of the Vanderlinde philosophy finally burn out under muzzle flash and blood. Then Dutch appears, older, thinner, more haunted. He steps out of the snowdrift as if the mountain itself has spat him back. He stands between John and Micah, just as he once stood between Arthur and the future, paralyzed by the same indecision that doomed his first son in all but name. Is this the Dutch from its humble beginnings, preaching freedom and family, or the paranoid outlaw who chose Micah's poison over Arthur's warning? For one long moment, it seems nothing has changed. Two guns raised, one man in the middle, the past closing its jaws. Then Dutch finally makes a choice he should have made on that first mountain. He turns, shoots Micah, and walks away in silence, leaving John with the money, the victory, and the burden of survival. Arthur could not kill Micah himself, but he set this chain in motion, saving John, awakening Dutch's shame, planting the idea that a different ending was possible. His last almost survival pays off here, not in his own heartbeat, but in John's chance to live the life Arthur died believing in. John's survival closes Arthur's personal journey, but the world does not remember Arthur Morgan. It remembers the Vanderlinde Gang. In the years that follow, their story drifts from newspapers to legend, from ink and blood to rumor and romance. Old wanted posters curl on saloon walls, their faces faded and prices long out of date. Lawmen's reports file them away as criminals and agitators, reducing a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, to dates, charges, and body counts. Around campfires and in barrooms, ranch hands and drifters trade secondhand tales of Dutch's speeches, Hosea's clever schemes, and Arthur's supposed brutality, each retelling sanding off another edge of the truth. From its humble beginnings, this gang claimed to be more than thieves. Dutch's philosophy painted them as rebels against a rigged civilization, the living embodiment of freedom in a world closing its fists, to strangers who glimpsed them racing across the plains. They might have looked exactly that, armed riders silhouetted against the sunset, defying the railroads, the banks, the government. The old ways were dying, and here rode the last defenders of some untamed ideal. But the romantic image leaves out the coughing fits in the dark, the fevered nights where Arthur clutched his chest and tried to breathe. It forgets Hosea, gunned down on courthouse steps while trying to talk, not shoot. It skips Lenny, shot on a rooftop and left in the rain, and the Downs family, destroyed so a gang could stay fed for one more week. The world remembers the outlaw glamour, not the broken families, the disease, the collateral graves scattered from Blackwater to Beaver Hollow. In the truest sense, the Vanderlinde Gang becomes an American myth, a story people tell themselves about freedom and rebellion to make the present feel less compromised. Dutch's speeches live on as quotes without context. His rants about liberty repeated by men who never saw him abandon his own wounded. The gang's raids are retold as daring capers, their victims blurred into faceless obstacles. Arthur's late awakening, his desperate attempt to save John and do one decent thing, is swallowed by the larger legend that only remembers the gun smoke. This is not an accident. America itself was built on ideals of liberty and equality that often masked exploitation and violence. From the very beginning, noble words covered ugly realities, just as Dutch's promises of family and loyalty hid his selfishness and fear. The gang's rise and fall is a small echo of the nation's grander pattern: beautiful speeches, brutal outcomes, and a public memory that clings to the speeches. Arthur's almost survivals mirror the country's own. Again and again, there are crossroads where a better path appears: help the Downs family instead of beating them, walk away from St. Denis, leave Micah in a cell, choose mercy over pride. The nation has its versions of those moments, chances to end conquest, to honor treaties, to share power, to let the vulnerable breathe. Each time, the easier road of profit and control wins, and another ghost joins the landscape. So when a ranch hand in New Austin laughs over a wild tale of Dutch Vanderlinde, what is really being celebrated? The freedom those men chased, or the cost others paid for their chase? The legend rides on, but under it. The ground is full of names the stories rarely mention, and somewhere in that gap between legend and reality, another figure waits in the wings, someone who will inherit the myth, inherit the guilt, and be forced to decide which version of the story to live in next. Because the next chapter of that legend does not belong to Arthur at all. It belongs to the boy who watched him ride away into the storm, and the man who tried to live up to a dead outlaw's last request. Jack Marston grows up on stories of Dutch's grand philosophy, of John's desperate loyalty, of Arthur's rough kindness and quiet regret. Around the Marston ranch table, Arthur becomes half memory, half myth, the gruff uncle who taught John to think twice, who taught Jack to fish, who tried, in the truest sense, to break from the old ways before they broke everyone else. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying, and the boy listening to those tales would inherit a world with even less room for men like him. By the time Jack reaches adulthood in Red Dead Redemption's epilogue, that inheritance has curdled. The polite, bookish child who once read about knights and civilization has become an outlaw in his own right, tracking Edgar Ross to a riverbank and killing him in cold blood. It is a story of freedom and vengeance, of dreams and delusions colliding in a single gunshot. Jack's revenge feels righteous, yet it also confirms the very cycle Arthur died trying to slow, a son repeating the sins that were supposed to die with his fathers. Many players cling to a different reading. They say Arthur survives through John, through Jack, through the Marston Ranch that briefly becomes the living embodiment of the future Arthur wanted. High honor endings reinforce this hope. the sun rising over the mountains, the horse's last ride, the suggestion that a man who spent his life as a lost soul might finally find peace. In that vision, Arthur's soul rides on in the choices John makes, in the way he holds his family close, in the way he finally walks away from Dutch's shadow. But is that truly survival, or only narrative solace? Arthur's body lies on a lonely ridge, his grave unvisited by history. His name is mostly erased from the official record, swallowed by civilization's march and the government's reports. Dutch is remembered as a madman, John as a traitor, Jack barely at all. The cycle of violence continues. The boy who heard about honor and restraint becomes another man with a revolver and a grudge. Yet something did change. John's choice to build a home, however doomed, is Arthur's final influence made manifest. From its humble beginnings as a broken-down ranch, Beecher's hope becomes a fragile experiment in another kind of freedom. Fences instead of train robberies, harvests instead of heists. For a few short years, that dream holds. For a few short years, Arthur's final plea to be better is not entirely swallowed by the dust. So does that count as survival? Or is Arthur Morgan just another ghost of the dying West, haunting the decisions of men who can never quite outrun him? The answer, like the man, refuses to be simple, and the next chapter will push that question even further. Arthur Morgan did not simply die on a mountainside. His story is a story of every door that almost opened, every road that almost led away from the noose tightening around his neck. From its humble beginnings with Dutch and Hosea finding a grieving teenager and turning him into a son, his life is framed as rescue. They save him from a short, ugly career as a petty outlaw, offer him family, purpose, even a rough kind of education. Yet that salvation is also the first chain. Blackwater is the next great crossroads. A ferry job, a pile of money, a plan to vanish before the world was changing too far to outrun. Had that robbery gone clean, the gang might have slipped into legend, scattered across the map under false names. Instead, the bloodbath on the docks burns their future and brands them as fugitives. Arthur does not choose the disaster, but by choosing Dutch's philosophy, he inherits its consequences. Survival is still possible, yet the path is already narrower. In Strawberry, when Micah is rotting in a cell, another door opens. Arthur could ride on, leave the loudmouth stranger to his fate, and nudge Dutch away from the man who will poison everything. Instead, loyalty and habit push him into that jail. Two outlaws breaking each other out, both believing they are too clever to fall. In Rhodes and then Saint Denis, the pattern hardens. The feuds, the bank job, Hosea and Lenny dying under the lights of a modern city. Each calamity is another moment when Arthur might walk away. Find a quieter life beyond Dutch's shadow. Each time, belief in the gang, in the dream of freedom, keeps him tethered. The Downs debt is the most brutal almost of all. A sick farmer, a desperate family, a beating that seems routine in a world where civilization wears a thin coat of respectability over cruelty. Arthur does not know, in that moment, that Thomas Downs's blood will bloom in his own lungs. He is not choosing death. He is choosing to do his job, to keep the camp fed, to honor an obligation to Dutch's system. Yet tuberculosis is the invisible price, already paid before the doctor ever says the word. That diagnosis finally offers a different escape, moral survival. The old ways were dying, and Arthur can see it now in the mirror of his own body. He begins to help John, to question Dutch openly, to carve out a sliver of redemption in the time he has left. At the end, on that final ridge, the last crossroads is laid bare. John or the money, the future or the past. In the truest sense, Arthur almost lives here, not by breathing longer, but by choosing who gets to breathe after him. Taken together, these are not random misfortunes. They are a lifetime of almost choices, each one understandable, each one closing another door until only sacrifice remains. That is what makes Arthur the living embodiment of tragic loyalty, and why his fate reflects back on the player's own attachment to this outlaw family, to its dreams and delusions. Because the next step is to ask, when a story is built on loyalty and regret, who truly survives, the man or the myth that remembers him? And that is why Arthur's story hurts so much. It is not a tale of monsters and saints, but of a man who keeps arriving one step too late to his own salvation. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom dangled just out of reach. In the truest sense, Arthur is the living embodiment of a question that refuses to be answered: how late is too late to change a life? From its humble beginnings, his bond with Dutch and Hosea is both rescue and sentence. Dutch saves a teenage thief from becoming a nameless corpse in some alley, teaches him to read, to think, to believe in a philosophy of outlaw honor. Hosea shows him how to hunt, how to see the world as it really is, how to recognize a con when it walks into camp wearing a fine suit. Yet that same family, that same idealistic vision of freedom, becomes the chain that keeps Arthur riding into one doomed town after another. Players connect to him because his kindness is never clean. He is rough, impatient, often cruel in the moment, then quietly gentle with a dying animal or a scared child. He laughs with Lenny on a St. Denis rooftop, then beats Thomas Downs in the mud for a debt that barely matters. Each act of mercy comes paired with a compromise. Each attempt to change crashes against years of loyalty and habit. Is it any wonder that his late-in-life turn toward honor feels so painfully familiar? His journey taps into fears that haunt almost every life. The fear of wasting time on the wrong dream. The fear of staying loyal to the wrong leader, the wrong job, the wrong idea of family. The fear of realizing, as Arthur does with Dutch, that the man followed for decades has been walking in circles, preaching freedom while marching everyone straight into civilization's gunfire. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur's tragedy is sensing that truth just as the door closes. His almost survivals echo ordinary choices. The job that drains health and hope stayed in long after the warning signs. The relationship defended long after it turned poisonous. The belief clung to even as evidence piled up that it was killing something essential. Arthur could have walked away after Strawberry, after Rhodes, after the bank in St. Denis. Instead, he keeps riding, as so many ride back to the same desk, the same house, the same lie. The power of Red Dead Redemption 2 is that it forces an uncomfortable double vision. On one level, it is a story of an outlaw watching his family fall apart. On another, it is a slow, relentless accounting of almost choices. The moments he pushes John to leave but stays himself. The rides where his cough worsens yet he refuses rest. The quiet chances to choose self-preservation over doomed loyalty. What would have been different if one of those rides had ended with Arthur turning his horse the other way? By the time the sun sets on that final mountain, the question lingers. At what moment was Arthur truly beyond saving? Was it the first cough? The first lie Dutch told that he swallowed? The first time he raised his gun for a cause he no longer believed in? And what does each answer reveal about how too late is defined in a world where the line between survival and surrender is always shifting? The next step is to follow that question into the ending itself, and to see what, if anything, survives with John. For all the talk of fate and inevitability, the truth is far messier. Every playthrough tells a slightly different story of Arthur Morgan's almost survival. The bones of the tragedy stay the same, but the flesh changes. In one world, he rides as a near saint, in another as a true outlaw to the bitter end, and each version says something about how the old ways were dying, and what a man chooses to cling to as they go. Some Arthurs spend the entire game with high honor, feeding the camp, helping strangers, sparing enemies who do not deserve it. Others lean into the gang's darker philosophy, embracing fear over respect and answering betrayal with cruelty. Some turn early, shaken by Jack's kidnapping or Hosea's death. Others only begin to question Dutch when the cough will no longer be ignored. From its humble beginnings in Coulter's frozen caves to the last ride toward Beaver Hollow, each choice carves out a different man standing on the same cliff edge. For many, there is one decision, one mission, where Arthur's fate feels truly sealed. Was it the day he rode to the Downs farm, dragging a desperate man into the mud for a debt that would poison his lungs and his conscience? Was it the St. Denis bank heist, that grand delusion of freedom where Hosea and Lenny died, Dutch snapped, and the dream of family shattered under electric street lamps? Or was it something quieter and more personal, a role-played moment where Arthur walked past a chance at mercy, or refused to walk away from Dutch when every instinct said to leave? There are endless imagined paths branching out from those moments. What if Micah had been left to rot in the Strawberry jail, just another loudmouth outlaw who never made it back to camp? What if certain jobs had been refused? If Arthur had drawn a line at Cornwall's refinery, at Angelo Bronte's schemes, at the final raid on the reservation? What if John had been pushed harder and earlier, if every conversation, every ride, had been Arthur demanding he leave, not asking? A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, becomes a map of exits never taken. Beneath all of this lies a harder question. Does Arthur achieve a kind of survival through John and Jack? Or is that only a comfort offered to soften an unchangeable ending? In the truest sense, he dies on that mountain. Yet John's ranch, Jack's books, and the small, fragile piece of Beecher's hope can feel like the living embodiment of everything Arthur wanted the gang to be before civilization closed in. Is that survival, or just a kinder illusion? In the end, the comments beneath this story become a campfire of their own. A circle of riders trading tales about their Arthur, about the missions where he almost lived, and the moments where the world was changing too fast for him to keep up. Around that fire, every version of him still breathes, if only for a little longer. In that flicker of memory and myth, Arthur Morgan does not simply die on a mountainside. He drifts at the edge of every campfire tale. A man who almost lived a different life. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family found and family lost, keeps circling back to one stubborn truth. He kept almost escaping the noose history had tied for him. From its humble beginnings, his life was already a narrow miss. When Dutch and Hosea pulled a teenage thief in from the cold, they did not just recruit an outlaw. They rescued a lost soul headed for a shallow grave in some nameless town. That rescue becomes the pattern. At Strawberry, he almost walks away from Dutch's chaos. After Rhodes and the blood on the street, he almost admits the philosophy has rotted. In Saint Denis, as Hosea falls and the world was changing under electric light, he almost sees that the dream is dead. The tragedy is simple. He is always one decision late. The tuberculosis that kills him arrives in a mundane chore, beating Thomas Downs in a debt collection that civilization would call business. The doctor in Saint Denis spells out the sentence, yet Arthur rides on, overworking, overbleeding, trying to hold together a family that is already gone. Freedom is always there, just over the next ridge, and every time he reaches for it, another obligation, another betrayal, another desperate plan from Dutch drags him back. In the truest sense, Arthur becomes the living embodiment of a changing America. He is pulled between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, between Dutch's grand speeches and the quiet fact of John Marston's little family. He can warn John again and again, urge him to leave, to run, to build a different world for Abigail and Jack. Yet those warnings are also confessions. Arthur is telling John to do what he never quite manages to do for himself. Across this entire saga, from the very beginning to the epilogue's final ride, the Vanderlinde Gang traces the arc of a nation. The old ways were dying, the railroads and Pinkertons and banks closing in, and this wandering family of misfits becomes a mirror for a country that talks about freedom while fencing in every horizon. Their story is not just robberies and shootouts, it is a slow collision between outlaw dreams and industrial reality. For those who have ridden through this whole tale, from Blackwater's disaster to Beaver Hollow's decay, the scale of what has just been revisited is immense. Decades of history, a web of loyalty and betrayal, every camp, every argument, every almost moment stitched into one long ride. This has been a story of an entire world closing down around a single man, and the people who loved, used, and abandoned him. There is more waiting on the trail ahead. Deep dives into the full lore of the gang's early years, John Marston's winding timeline, from orphan thief to reluctant family man, and the hidden almost survivals buried in missions from Saint Denis to Strawberry all hold more fragments of this broken legend. Every side job, every mercy spared or bullet fired in anger, leaves echoes that carry into John's survival, and the gang's long shadow. So as Arthur rides, one last time, into that fading light on the ridge, the image lingers, a tired man, back straight in the saddle, finally at peace with what he chose and what he could not change. For anyone who wants more long-form, complete story breakdowns of gaming's greatest tragedies, this campfire does not have to burn out. Subscribe to keep riding, like to keep this story alive in the dust and the dusk, and share it with those who remember the man on the mountain. Somewhere out there, Arthur Morgan almost survives again, every time his story is told.